If you love ancient history, then this is the channel for you. History Hit TV. It's like Netflix, but dedicated just to history documentaries, including a huge library of ancient history content from the 9th Legion to Boudicca to the First Britain. Simply check out the details in the description below. And make sure you use code Odyssey on sign up. Camel get out laughter. This is brilliant. This is obviously an iconic image. Taking a camel ride by the pyramids, surely it encapsulates the spirit of Egypt, but such an image is completely misleading because there weren't any camels here when the pyramids were built 4,500 years ago. And that's the thing, ancient Egypt is instantly recognizable, but all too often completely misunderstood. So I'm going to try and change that. Good luck. Chakras. The Great Pyramid of Giza, final resting place of King Khufu, over 140 meters from bottom to top. No wonder it still pulls in the crowds and the occasional Egyptologist here. It's hard to really get it into words, but we are now entering into the depths of this iconic monument of ancient Egypt. It's a very busy iconic monument though, thank you, and as we set foot on this journey upwards, it's a brilliant metaphor for the way that the ancient Egyptian civilization literally rose up from the earth to a real zenith. So come with me, and I'll show you something really brilliant, because the pyramids are really only the tip of the iceberg. Oh, flipping out. So all this was a big city, overwhelming in size, that is absolutely superb. In this series, I'm going to explore the story of what I consider to be the world's greatest civilization, more than 4,000 years of history that has shaped our world and left unmistakable marks that can still be read today. I'll be looking into every nook and cranny, from little-known tombs — it's staggering, I've never ever been into a tomb quite like this before — to the hidden corners of vast monuments. It's like being on top of the world, isn't it? Yeah, we are in the top of Kars. Or it's really no surprise that weird and wonderful theories about ancient Egypt crop up all the time. But what I find so amazing is that this most intriguing civilization was actually created by people not so very different from you and me. And that's the story I want to tell, a story full of secret treasures, dark deeds, and sometimes controversial theories. This mask was originally made for someone else, and for the first time I'll be piecing it all together, from the earliest Egyptians to the last of the pharaohs. Wow, look at that, look at that. Oh, that is so beautiful. Welcome to my story of ancient Egypt. The big question is, how did ancient Egypt begin? Where did the first Egyptians and their extraordinary culture come from? This immortal civilization was thousands of years in the making, so to pull it all together is a daunting task, but bear with me as it's utterly fascinating. But we won't begin with massive monuments, but with some enigmatic clues you could easily miss. This is Kurt, around 100 kilometers south of Luxor. Unless you're an archaeologist, you almost certainly won't have heard of it, because there aren't any great temples or royal tombs to admire, but high in the cliffs you can see real signs of ancient life here, thousands of years before the pyramids. And this is where our story begins. Welcome me to Khartoum. Thank you so much for letting me come here. It's incredibly exciting. It's the first time you're here. I suppose nothing escapes the sharp eye of Dr. Dirk Hoyer, and he's got something very special to show me. Not many people have been here before you, because it's a quite recent discovery. These carvings in the rock reveal an amazing story about the beginnings of Egyptian life. It's a 1900-year-old picture gallery, complete with its own hippo backline, very short tail, hind legs, belly line, front legs, and the mouth is shown. Hippo is smiling, but then again a hippo is always smiling. But another type of animal is by far the most common here. That's cattle. It's not just cattle. There's the mighty aurochs, the wild buffet, wild cattle, and the extremely powerful images that seem to be in movement. They're charging down towards us, aren't they? These wild aurochs were ancestors of the domestic cow, and nearly 20,000 years ago beef was the main thing on the menu. About maybe 50% of their diet was composed of aurochs, so they were experts and masters in representing this animal. It's always high on the cliff, very prominent positions that give an excellent panorama over what must have been in the Paleolithic the hunting grounds of the people. It's easy to picture these early hunters here as they track their prey, but the landscape would have looked very different from today, because back then this was savanna, grassland, a green and fertile region. Do we have any idea why these creatures were engraved on these rocks here? We can guess, Joe, but we don't know. Maybe they wanted to influence the hunting. Maybe this is some sort of hunting magic. It really is magical to sit here and imagine Egypt's earliest nomadic people passing right through this spot and portraying on these very rocks the animals that they saw all around them. Human figures and boats joined the animals as the carvings became stranger and stranger, but these carvings are also the earliest glimpse of the amazing things to come. These are the first signs of what makes ancient Egypt, well, ancient Egypt, as for its ancient landscape, is evolved under dramatic circumstances. 10,000 years ago, gravity tilted the entire Earth of its axis by about half a degree, and this had a profound effect on climate, and as the world began to change, Egypt would never be the same again. Now, these early people were nomads, seasonally mobile pastoralists who moved around following the summer rains, and these rains really were the vital life-bringing force which created the greenery on which wild animals depended. But of course, with climate change, these rains began to dry up. You can cut the rain. The diminishing rainfall forced both animals and people towards large lakes which formed during the rainy season. One such area is Nata Playa, 100 kilometers southwest of Aswan, and here these nomadic hunters began to settle into communities, but still reliant on the annual summer rains. They needed to predict exactly when these would return, and so they turned to the night sky. Welcome to the beginning of time, quite literally, because this is Egypt's oldest calendar at around 7,000 years old. This stone circle from Nababta Playa is the earliest evidence of how Egyptian weather forecasters became astronomers. They aligned its central stones to the circumpolar stars visible in the night sky all year round. When the sun appeared directly overhead, the stones cast no shadow. The midsummer rains were approaching. This meant that the animals would drink, the plants would grow, and the world would survive for another year. So in many ways, this circle represents the solution to the very real problem of survival. But the Egyptians would take this a step further. I think the really great thing about these many monumental markers is that this is the earliest example we have of the way in which the Egyptians are aligning their monuments to various things, to the sky, to the cardinal points, and from now on every tomb, every temple, every monument will be aligned to the heavens, to the very gods themselves. If the stars and the rain were this closely linked, then this world and the next must be one and the same, and this has been described as Egypt's earliest sculpted stone monument and dates from around 5000 BC. This chunk of sandstone was quarried over a mile away from where it was eventually discovered. This certainly suggests a kind of sense of community where people were already working together to achieve a desired aim. In this case, the stone was hauled into place, and then there are clear signs that it's been sculpted into a specific shape. Now, you might have to go with me on this, but some believe that this is in fact a cow with its large hind quarters and this sculpted head. Now, the cow was a vital part of everyday life for these people. It was a source of meat, of milk, and of blood, key sources of protein they needed to keep them healthy. And yet so important was the cow, they chose to take it through into the afterlife with them to sustain them on a spiritual level. And this is the very beginnings of the great cow goddess. Hathor. Hathor may have started off as a source of milk and meat, but eventually she would be loved and idolized by millions of Egyptian kings. She represented love, joy, beauty, and motherhood, and although her image develops from a lifelike animal to a female face with cow's ears, this may be Hathor's very earliest incarnation. Yet Hathor is only one of a multitude of gods and goddesses. The Egyptians just couldn't get enough of them. Over the centuries emerged hundreds, if not thousands, of deities, each with a specific purpose and appearance. Some came in human form, some had animal heads. They could be male, female, even androgynous. It seems that there were few aspects of life that didn't have their own gods. We know that in the very earliest times, gods resemble familiar things, the world around them, elements of nature, and certainly animals, and over time the animals, their forms, their shapes, their characteristics were distilled down into this sort of divine figure. Each one wore it for a different quality. In the case of the ram, they were worshipped for their procreative powers. In the case of the cow, for their nurturing motherly instincts. Then, of course, you've got rather different creatures, the dangerous creatures, the ones that lived on the edges of the Egyptian world, the lions, the crocodiles, the jackals. But it wasn't just about finding the appropriate divinity, it was about gaining power over them. The goddess Sekhmet was a ferocious lioness and the bringer of death to humans, so the Egyptians transformed her into a deity as a way of controlling her destructive powers by worshipping Sekhmet. It was believed that she could be placated and transformed into a more benign deity on so many levels. The Egyptians were trying to tap into nature to affect the way that nature then in turn affected them. In many ways, Egypt's unique religion was the glue that held society together, uniting the population and underpinning almost every aspect of life. It's everywhere, in tombs, in temples, in everyday life. And yet, there is another even more fundamental element without which ancient Egypt would never have existed at all. Later Greek historians famously observed that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, and how right they were, because as the climate continued to change, the desert lakes eventually dried up, leaving the Egyptians with just one source of water. This is an incredibly special place located in modern Sudan. It nonetheless forms the very source of Egypt, for it's the place where two great rivers meet, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which combine here to form the world's longest river, flowing from the heart of Africa and out into the Mediterranean Sea for much of the year. The wide, lazy White Nile is the main source of water until annual rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands swells the faster flowing Blue Nile today. The modern Aswan dams hold back these flood waters, but until the 20th century huge volumes of water and fertile silt surged down river to flood the entire Nile Valley, bringing life and fertility to the desert. That is Egypt. This annual Nile flood was the single most important event in the lives of every ancient Egyptian, for its life giving waters brought the nutrients and minerals which enriched the soil all along its banks, and this allowed agriculture to flourish. Egypt is blessed with some of the most fertile land in the world, where farmers can grow everything from sweet corn and garlic to bananas, sugarcane, and cotton. Boy, it's quite intensive farming, isn't it? The land gives the people a lot, doesn't it? Yes, but we need to give the land also rest. We grew one time, and we leave it for 1 month, then after we use the land again to grow again. That's amazing that it only needs 1 month rest time, and then it can be planted again. Yeah, sometime 15 days, sometime 1 month, yeah. But it really does emphasize that this land of Egypt has always been so rich and so giving to the people. It's always given the people everything they need, and it's the Nile that turned this desert land into a paradise. And 7,000 years ago, the people who could no longer survive in an increasingly desert landscape were forced to migrate towards it as their only source of water. So ancient Egypt took shape as these people came together along the banks of the Nile. In the north, settlements clustered around the Delta and the Fume, and in the south around the Kenabend. This was the beginning of Egypt's so-called two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, which developed into two distinct cultures. But what they both had in common was the astonishing fertility replenished every year by the miracle of the Nile. El Kab, located to the south of the Kenabend, is one of Upper Egypt's earliest settlements, and while it may lack the wow factor of the pyramids, it's actually far more revealing to see traces of this amazing evolution, because here we can see how a nomadic lifestyle was soon replaced by a settled social structure. And although it was a slow and gradual process, archaeologist Elizabeth Hart can identify each stage of this transformation, sending land into small pits where you do work in an enclosed space, don't you? But it's much cooler down here. It's lovely actually. So down at this level we have sterile soil where nobody lived, and then starting around 4200 BC are layers of silt from the Nile flood, followed by wind-accumulated sand, and then another layer of silt, and then more sand. And here you can see it really well, a thin silt layer from the Nile coming up and flooding, and then the sand. And over here we have a hearth feature, so this tells us that humans were actually living on these and coming into the Nile Valley, and then moving back out. And we also found lots of potsherds and stone tools in these layers. You know, it might be a small space, but you've got people's real lives unfolding within it, haven't you? And we have thousands of years of it here. When we started, people were just moving into the Nile Valley. They were just starting to farm, and by the end here we have pharaohs and a whole united Egypt. It's really impressive when you think about all the change that happened over this chunk of sand. Although we are still centuries away from the grand pharaonic monuments, you can still find traces of the lives these ancient people lived if you look hard enough, for very little has survived except for tons of pottery. Yeah, this one is a year, so it's 5,000 years older. It's 5,000 years old. They're also tactile, these things, aren't they? These pots help us to identify when this early society began to produce a food surplus, a pivotal transition which required robust pottery for the storage of large-scale food and drink production. These bread molds from slightly later are one of the most common finds. So you heat the mold, then the dough gets into it, and by the heat of the mold the bread will be baked. But this comes in massive amounts. These are the beer jars, are bread and beer, and the Egyptian staples. Oh, nice size of a beer jar. This is the nuts and bolts of how Egyptian chronology all came together in the early days, isn't it? Yes, the pottery is especially fundamental to understand how people were living, yet in Egypt living was only half the story, because what really sets the ancient Egyptians apart is their view of death. To them, death wasn't the end of life, but a new beginning, a transformation. from the world of the living into an everlasting afterlife, and such a belief would shape Egypt's most mysterious practice and my favorite subject, mummification, although the origins of this enigmatic tradition are only now becoming clearer. The burial of their dead had a strong significance from the very earliest times. This is a typical burial from around 400 BC. The body is curled into the fetal position, and here placed within a reconstructed pit grave, surrounded by the belongings she might have had in his earthly life, like pottery, jewelry, and a palette for preparing cosmetics. Everything that was important to him in life accompanied him into death, and I think that's quite significant, because it shows that already 5,500 years ago, the Egyptians wanted to take it all with them. They clearly believed that something happened beyond death. Death was simply a transition into another state of existence when you continue to live, and it was assumed you would need everything you'd needed in your life on Earth. His body was naturally mummified in the hot desert sand, but its placement here may not have been accidental, because even when dead, the body had to be preserved in order to house the soul for eternity. A skeleton simply wasn't good enough. Skeletons' bone style are very, very anonymous, and yet when the soft tissue, the skin, the hair is all present, we are ourselves, and that's exactly what this individual represents. Being face to face with one of the very earliest Egyptians gives us insight into the development of their ideas about the afterlife. It started off as a practical thing, burying the dead in a relatively small space bundled up, and then it developed these layers of kind of like the symbolism feet or positioned this idea in rebirth into the next world. It's almost like the seed from which the Egyptian belief system evolved. This is the very beginning of a process which would be repeated a millionfold throughout Egyptian history. It's this combination of the esoteric underpinned by the practical, which really does sum up the Egyptians. In a nutshell, from the very beginning, the Egyptians were masters of making sense of their world, no matter how complex and mystifying it might seem to us, and this same ability to bring order is also found in the way they structured their early society, adopting levels of bureaucracy that border on the obsessive. In the ancient city of Abydos, the site of Egypt's first royal burial ground, archaeologists found the origins of a system that we still have to put up with today. It's most fitting that this city of death was the fine spot of the earliest means of calculating that other great certainty taxes. The evidence comes from small bone and ivory labels like these, which have been dated to around 3,250 BC. The originals are probably the size of a postage stamp, and you can see that each one is engraved with images of animals, of birds, of plants, and so forth, and each one is pierced for suspension to a chest or pottery vessel, which would have contained all linen grain, and it's thought that these symbols represent the regions that produce these commodities, which were then brought here to Abydos, thought to have been sent as tax payments. These tiny labels show how these early people were already capable of collecting duties from a vast geographical area. Some experts even believe these symbols can be vocalized by turning the simple drawings into sounds. Makes this the world's earliest known writing. Now, isn't it interesting that the world's earliest writing wasn't developed to express some great outpouring of emotion or express grand passion? It was simply a means of calculating taxes. These symbols soon became a sophisticated writing system of elegant signs we call hieroglyphs, which means sacred carvings, and these signs represented every aspect of the Egyptian world, which were only translated in 1822 with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, and a common language was needed as goods were transported between the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. The people of Lower Egypt had also developed trade links with the rest of the ancient world, but as more warlike regions began to emerge in Upper Egypt, it soon became clear that the Nile had spawned two very different and distinctive cultures, and in many ways the only thing they really had in common was this great river. The inevitable clash between these cultures is recorded on what many considered to be ancient Egypt's founding document, taking the form of a giant ceremonial cosmetic palette. This is an exact copy of the original Nama palette, and however idealized and embellished, it depicts the pivotal moment when the southern king Nama defeated his northern enemy. A split second after this, mace comes down onto this northern enemy's head, and he's executed, he's killed. He is no more. Nama himself remains the first king of a united Egypt, and what this means is that the whole of the country is now united under one man's rule. He is setting himself up quite literally as the god king, as the one central figure at the very pinnacle of the pyramid that forms Egyptian society, and from him everything else flows. Egypt is now the world's first nation state. What made ancient Egypt is all here: the art forms, the forms of religion, and even the world's first writing. Hieroglyphic script. This is the name of Narmer, the catfish Nar, and the chisel Mr. N. striking catfish as the first king of Egypt. Narmer is protected by the cow goddess Hathor, stands beside Horus, the falcon god of kingship, and is dressed in all the same paraphernalia as every king who succeeds him. He has the tie on false beard to emphasize his virility and his strength, and this is matched of course by the tie on bull's tail. It's a wonderful feature, this idea you could just tie a little tail onto the back of the belt and then take into yourself the power of a bull. This palette is Egypt's earliest historical document. It's the blueprint of how every future pharaoh will be portrayed in the company of the gods, yet perhaps most significant is Narmer's smiting pose. This powerful image with the mace held high will be endlessly repeated throughout Egypt's long history. This is a horrible way to die, to have your brains bludgeoned out, and yet even this the Egyptian artist can show in an almost bull-like pose. It's been sanitized, it's been elevated to a piece of art, and yet the message still gets through. For the next 3,000 years, every one of Egypt's subsequent rulers would try and link themselves to Egypt's first pharaoh to rule legitimately and successfully. They had to be absorbed into the complexities of the Egyptian hierarchy, both in this world and the next. So their names were recorded on a series of king lists, a kind of royal family tree, and the best preserved of these is here in the temple of Seti I at Abydos. It lists himself and 75 of his royal predecessors, going right back to the very dawn of Egyptian history, with the very first king up there, King Narmer. And the other important detail about this is that it's essentially emphasizing that royal continuity, because Seti has his own young son, Ramses the Crown Prince, actually reading out these names on a piece of papyrus paper. So it's as if Seti is saying to the gods, look, I'm now pharaoh, and this is my son who will succeed me to become yet another name on this remarkable list. In all, Egypt had over 300 pharaohs organized into 30 dynasties, but in the case of Egypt's earliest kings, being merely immortal was not enough. They needed to prove their divinity by exercising absolute control over their subjects, and the evidence for this was found in the desolate desert surrounding the ancient city of Abydos. This was Egypt's first royal burial ground, the original version of the Valley of the Kings. Now being here, you get a real sense of the importance of this place for the ancient Egyptians, for as the wind funnels down this valley and swirls around the sand, if you listen very carefully, you can hear a whispering sound, a whispering once thought to be the voices of the very dead themselves. And here Egypt's earliest kings were laid to rest within huge subterranean burial chambers like this, the location of the final resting place of Egypt's third pharaoh, King Jur, one of the largest and most complex tombs of the first dynasty. And although it's been recovered in sand, it clearly demonstrates the power that Jur still wielded. Even in death, Jur himself was buried here in the central chamber. But all around the 318 subsidiary graves of his courtiers, not only that, a little way beyond, many others were also buried. In total, 587 individuals accompanied this man into the next world, which is incredible enough. But there is evidence of a more sinister twist. The fact that this tomb was all sealed over at the same time suggests these people may have been victims of ritual sacrifice, perhaps even ritual stabbing, as portrayed in art of the time, and certainly that power over life and death would give any king a godlike status. Now later kings seem to have realized that killing all their courtiers in one go was not the best use of people who were a precious state resource after all, who'd be around to make the next king his cup of tea. Although this cruel and short-sighted practice of ritual killing soon died out, it had nonetheless demonstrated that Egypt's rulers had complete control over their subjects, an essential step along the route towards building the pyramids. And indeed, Egypt itself, welcome. Yet the Egyptian people were not slaves by this time. Egypt was a land of plenty, where all could enjoy its bounty, both in life and in death. This is the later tomb of an official called Ayar, and here he is greeting as he's coming to the door of his own tomb, emerging from the walls captured in all his splendor, with his finery on his jeweled belt and his white linen kilt. Even details down to his little sort of pencil moustache looks a little bit like Clark Gable. To be honest, the scenes in his colorful tomb depict a refined life that's a world away from Egypt's earliest farmers. We have Yukata seated in front of a table of food offerings. There's fruit, vegetables, wine, and so forth. The bearers are coming forward with offerings to sustain his solar ruta. Was the royal butcher an important member of court, and with royal courtiers no longer sacrificed for burial? With their king, they could now make their own elaborate preparations for the afterlife. There are a couple of scenes up here of the household servants making the beds of Irakat and his family. They're stretching out the linen sheets. They're bringing Even a little fly whisk and the ancient Egyptian pillow, the headdress there, so even in the afterlife yukata will be comfortable. Ikatis tomb is in Saqqara, a sprawling city of the dead for Egypt's first capital, Memphis, yet Saqqara wasn't just the burial site of courtiers but of kings and the site of a revolution in royal tomb building. And whereas previously the dead had tended to be buried away in the desert, hidden away, almost here at Saqqara high on the desert escarpment, the dead were literally placed on display. Up to this point, the Egyptians had tended to build their tombs and temples like their houses from organic materials from the mud, brick, wood, and reeds, which rarely survive. But in the Third Dynasty, the great innovator, King Jossa, built his legacy in something far more permanent, for he built in stone, which could potentially last forever. Joseph built this huge stone wall to surround his tomb complex, although his architects and workmen still drew their inspiration from the natural world. You can see that the masons are just trying to get their head around how to actually work with this stuff, what forms to put it in. So we have Egypt's first hyper-style hall of columns, sure, but it's taking the form of reeds bound together to make the kind of columns that would have been in Joseph's palace down by the Nile. But this, of course, is a house for death. This is a palace of eternity, and must be built in something as solid as stone. At the rear of his complex is an intriguing stone shrine where I can come face to face with King Martin himself. The shrine looks like it's suffering a severe case of substance, and yet the Egyptians purposefully built it on this very definite tilt. It has these two holes here where modern tourists can see Martin, but Martin can see them. They can actually see beyond them, cause this faces true north. It faces the northern stars, which the Egyptians call the imperishable ones, and so at death Martin's soul could rise up and merge with these stars, so he too would be imperishable, and he too would never die. In order to ensure that his soul could live on, Martin's body needed somewhere safe to rest within a tomb truly fit for a king. Most burials were topped by a simple single-story building called a star, meaning bench, but Joe's did something radical. Martin really wanted to impress with his very monument, so another step was built on top, and I think Joe's must have quite liked the effect that this gave, and so built a third step, a fourth step, a fifth step, sixth step. When they stood back and looked, they realized they'd built Egypt's first pyramid. Pretty impressive. The step pyramid stands over 60 meters tall and still dominates the Saqqara landscape. At the time, it was the largest building on Earth, reinforcing Martin's status as a living god in the grandest of ways. It certainly secured his place in Egyptian history, with ancient visitors flocking here to marvel at his achievements. Now, Martin had created a true landmark, but he'd also created Egypt's first tourist attraction. If you come with me, I'll show you the evidence, because in here we have what many tourists still leave today: appreciative graffiti. And this is the original handwriting of a couple of ancient visitors from around 1300 BC who were so impressed by what they saw they described Martin's pyramid as if heaven were in it, and they credit Joe's with being the inventor of stone. But why did Martin build this? Was it just an ego trip or an exercise in personal vanity? Or was it designed to show the world just how far Egypt had come? Because in only a few centuries, these desperate people had come together to create the world's first nation-state. Egypt was now an unstoppable powerhouse, a nation unified both politically and culturally under a single ruler, whose authority was limitless. Yet it wasn't just the king who could achieve immortality, for the man who designed and built Martin's pyramid was destined to become even more famous than the pharaoh he had served. This statue base once held a full-sized figure of King Martin, but carved into its base is also the name of his architect. And here we can see it with this reed, the owl, and then the little mat with a little bread loaf on which reads Imhotep. And here he is the man himself, although most likely a commoner by birth. Imhotep rose through the ranks to become one of Egypt's most powerful officials. He was made the royal chancellor, the prime minister. He was even made high priest of the sun god. He was the ultimate local boy made good, because he then gained a reputation as an academic, as a great healer, and he was famous the length and breadth of Egypt. He was ultimately worshipped as a god. Imhotep represents the ultimate in social mobility, a kind which was certainly possible within Egypt's unique society. This was a society in which ideas were often taken to extremes, with 1.5 million people united by an absolute belief in the power of their king and in the certainty of the afterlife. Egypt enters its most ambitious era so far. The Pyramid Age. Over 130 pyramids would be built across Egypt, and they represent The zenith in royal tomb building, huge state-sponsored civil engineering projects that used vast resources of materials, manpower, and time. The largest of all, the Great Pyramid of King Khufu, which took over 20 years to build, and in order to build something so ambitious, an entire city was created specifically to house the construction workers just beyond this monumental wall. It's known as the Wall of the Crow, and it separated the silent sacred space of the dead from the busy bustling city of the pyramid builders. This 5-hectare site once housed workshops, bakeries, a tool-making facility, and a fish processing area. For this was an integrated self-sufficient community of over 8,000 people who even had their own medical care anthropological archaeologist. Dr. Richard Reading has been excavating the site since 1991. Where we are now, this is kind of a big workshop, a big industrial park, where there's lots of activity going on out here. They were probably producing granite statues, maybe granite columns. We find tools out here for polishing the granite. We find tools out here for chipping at the granite. It's very well planned. We have 3 streets. We have North Street, Main Street we're on, and we have South Street down there. So we're walking down Main Street. You're walking down Main Street. The pyramid workers live cheek by jowl in 2-story barracks. You would have walked in, you would have been in a very quiet, dark, long, narrow room. This is where they would have slept. There would have been a higher bed for the overseer at each end, and then everybody would have laid down, probably with their head in this direction or the other direction. Exactly like this. You would be lying here like this, and this would be your nighttime position, very comfortable. Can I try out the overseer bed? Sure, you want to try out the overseer's bed. Their delusions of grandeur. Is it this one or that one? Yeah, it's that's the wall, the way right where you are. Is that, oh, so this is all right. So if I sat down here, yeah, the overseer's bed is actually buried under a few centimeters of sand, and the floor here was probably under about a half a meter of sand. So, oh, this is nice. I am keeping my eye on you now. That's right, you can see me if I got up in the night and I tried to sneak out to go someplace, you would see me. Everything the workers needed was here on site. The team have recovered data that shows that workers consume 70 for cattle and 257 sheep and goats each week. This corral area could hold a week's supply of cattle before more were shipped in from Egypt's grasslands. You could have almost just-in-time delivery coming down, another small herd coming down from Kuman or the Delta coming down, and in it's a really well-oiled machine. You can see now how efficient the Egyptians were at obtaining their food, bringing it to the right place at the right time for the right people. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It wasn't just simply the food, it was everything. There was the copper to make tools. There was the stone being brought in here from Asan and other areas. So a lot of things were coming into here. These were government workers. They got everything from the government. In many ways, this settlement is Egypt in microcosm, a highly ordered social structure with job specialization and mass cooperation. It's hard to believe that in a relatively short period of time, Egypt had been transformed from simple subsistence into a united state which could provide for everyone who worked on its behalf. What we're seeing here is the final building block in Egyptian culture, but not just for the pyramid age. For once this infrastructure was in place, it would never change. So whether they're building a pyramid or setting up a colossal statue, the level of organization and cooperation would remain the same. But this was the foundation stone of Egypt. The pyramids are eternal testament to just how powerful Egypt had now become, and in many ways they are Egypt at this time, dominating everything around them on a gigantic scale, and towering above the Giza landscape is the Great Pyramid. It took around 20,000 people to set in place the 2.3 million blocks of limestone. It remained the tallest structure anywhere in the world for 3,800 years, until the building of Lincoln Cathedral spire in 1300 AD. It's a phenomenal achievement for any civilization at any time, but for me its exterior can't compare to the sense of wonder once you venture inside. The roof of the Grand Gallery passageway is built of multiple layers of enormous limestone slabs rising over 8 meters high, massive blocks of masonry, built on a godlike scale. That's surely what Khufu wanted. I sincerely hope Kung Fu's eternal resting place was rather less congested than it is today, but it still gives a real atmosphere of the busyness that must have been here on a daily basis. These guys were hauling massive blocks hundreds of feet up, literally into the air. These guys were magicians. Just look how brilliantly these courses have been laid. These are perfect, and defy any modern architect to be able to replicate this using the tools that the ancients had at their disposal. Wow. We are at the zenith We're at the heart of the pyramid now, King Khufu's burial chamber, and we've hit it at exactly the right moment because the pyramid is closed for lunch, so we've got the whole place to ourselves, and you really get a sense of the sanctity of this divine mausoleum. The walls and roof of the burial chamber are lined entirely in granite, and it was within here that the body of the great King Khufu was sealed, ready for his final journey into the afterlife. We're at the heart of the pyramid in terms of its architecture, but we're literally in the heart of ancient Egypt. I feel like I should be speaking in a whisper because the acoustics are so extraordinary. It's a sterile, plain, stark room. It's pretty much like a bank vault, and when you think about it, that's exactly what it is, because it once contained Egypt's greatest treasure, the mummified body of the god king, which contained the soul not only of Khufu but of all the generations of pharaohs stretching way back to King Narmer. Forget the jewels, forget the gold. Egypt's real treasure was in here, and it's the first time I've ever been in here without crowds and crowds of other people. And speaking now, the sound of the voice reverberating around immediately takes you back 4,500 years to the day of the funeral, to the sacred words that the priest would have chanted to revive the soul of the god king. It's miraculous. It's a wonderful, spectacular place that affects every sense, visually, audibly, in every sense. It's beyond words, really. I think I probably better stop talking now. So now, all the elements that made up of ancient Egypt were in place: a well-fed, highly organized population that unswervingly followed their god king, and all of whom shared this fervent belief in an afterlife. Life in Egypt was good, with its mighty pharaohs, multiple gods, and magnificent art. It's easy to think that ancient Egypt was always powerful and successful, but there were also darker times: conflict, civil war, famine, and an overall feeling of catastrophe, and the only way it could survive was through its own resilience and the strongest of leadership. Now this is Sesostris III, who ruled Egypt almost 4,000 years ago. He's strong, and he's muscular, everything a pharaoh should be, and yet look at his face. His scowling features have been interpreted to suggest his harsh rule, and his large ears, his ability to hear any plots against him. Sesostris embodies the way Egypt's monarchs ruled during its turbulent times. This king controlled his enemies through a series of military fortresses and through magical curses. But this is a new era in Egypt's history, not only ruled by military power, but by fear and suspicion, and Egypt's darkest times threatened to destroy its entire civilization. I've already explored how Egypt's ancient culture began thousands of years earlier, blessed by the river Nile and a rich natural environment, and a society united by a complex ideology. But in this episode, we'll see how the massive self-confidence of the Pyramid Age was not to last, as a dark age brought this civilization to the brink of annihilation. Make no mistake, this is the home of the dead, and we're in amongst them. These were times of famine, civil war, and anarchy. Kings have been reduced to something on a minuscule level, but this collapse triggered one of the greatest revivals of ancient times, with Egypt re-emerging more powerful and wealthy than ever before. Welcome to my story of ancient Egypt, Saqqara, where Egypt's Great Pyramid Age began. But among its glories, there's also evidence of a far less well-known side to Egypt's story: its descent into a dark age. The zenith of Egypt's old kingdom was the Great Pyramid at Giza, and only 200 years later King Une's Causeway was created. It might not look much today, but it's the highlight of Une's pyramid complex, a 750 meters long causeway which symbolically connected life and death. It goes right from the Nile Valley all the way up onto the high desert plateau, right to the foot of the pyramid of Une's. So it would have been used for his funeral procession, but it would also have drawn up the life-giving force from the valley below up to the city of the dead. Here at Saqqara, a narrow slit in the roof once allowed enough lighting. But the extraordinary thing is that this causeway was designed for a sole purpose: the king's funeral procession. Carved upon its walls are scenes revealing both sides of life, the forces of order and of chaos. It first portrays an idealized version of Egypt, a time of plenty. Here we can see typical scenes within an Egyptian temple, or recontext scenes of the rich bounty of Egypt: all the fruit, the vegetables, the crops, the meat, the fish, all the wealth of the natural environment of Egypt, which was all obviously brought to the land through the good offices of the king, the bringer of all bounty, the intermediary with the gods. But also this causeway contained something rather more disturbing: evidence that dark forces were at work. Further on down the causeway emerged a counterpart image, the flip side of bounty, an image so unusual it's now displayed in Saqqara's museum, and it really is one of ancient Egypt's most haunting and revealing works of art. Here we see these dark forces at work. What we have are two rows of emaciated victims of famine. These poor people, They're weak with hunger, they're falling down, they're suffering. And this is basically ancient Egypt coming face to face with reality, because these are believed to be the Bedouins who inhabited the desert fringes of Egypt, so it's as if this kind of idea of suffering the forces of chaos are on the periphery of Egypt, but they're getting ever closer to the Nile Valley. Egypt is starting to waken up to the fact that chaos isn't all that far away. This is ancient Egypt beginning to suffer. Such gritty realism had rarely been portrayed before. Chaos depicted as the suffering of real people. This isn't happening in some esoteric realm of the gods where chaos is sort of portrayed as some sort of disparate magical force, very detached from reality. This is reality through such realistic images. The Egyptians were expressing their fears to the gods, appealing to them to keep these forces of chaos at bay, but instead the starving famine victims would turn out to be a chilling omen. Up until now, Egypt's prosperity had flowed from its one source of water, the River Nile, whose annual floods enriched the soil, allowing life and agriculture to flourish. This natural abundance was the very bedrock on which Egypt and its perpetual world order was able to thrive, but this lifeblood was about to run dry. Evidence shows that at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the Nile flood levels fell dramatically as the very thing that brought them life began to diminish. The Egyptians believed that their gods had begun to abandon them, and for the next century, the ancient texts talk of suffering, starvation, and even cannibalism. Traditionally, Egyptian society had been built on a belief in the divine power of its kings. Without this belief, the Pyramid Age would never have been possible. But now, in its time of need, Egypt's king seemed increasingly powerless in the face of such natural disaster, and this would come to a head with a ruler who was well past his prime, claimed to have lived for 100 years. He was Egypt's longest-lived monarch king. Peep 2 in this space was once a ceremonial running track, the type of place where Peep would have to display his physical prowess to prove himself to his people. Now, when any pharaoh had celebrated 30 years' reign, they had to perform the Jubilee ceremonies, and this involved running the ceremonial Jubilee race for times around this circuit. As king of the north, for times around the circuit. As king of the south, it was the ultimate public display of their fitness to rule and their strength. It really showed he was in charge of Egypt, but that's where Peep's advancing age would eventually let him down. Of course, when Pharaoh was relatively young and fit, this would have been a great celebration, but in the case of poor Peep, then in his 90s, it became all too clear that Pharaoh was no living god, and this really undermined the whole concept of what it was to be a pharaoh. Clearly, as mortal as his subjects, any natural disaster must have seemed the fault of this less than superhuman king, and this combination of a weakening pharaoh and failing harvest led to rapid decline. Ancient Egypt now faced its first major political crisis, for the power and apparent divinity of the pharaoh that had been so very important in the Pyramid Age had now vanished. Everything that bound Egyptian society together had begun to fall away, and Egypt was plunged into a dark age. In this time of growing uncertainty, when the Egyptians had lost faith in both the monarchy and Statuan religion, they increasingly turned to the power of magic. This is a rather unsettling thing. It's an ancient Egyptian mask. It's almost 4,000 years old, and it's made of linen covered in a thin layer of plaster and then painted predominantly black with colors picked out on various features. Of course, the Egyptians are well known for making elaborate arrangements for their afterlife. The death mask placed over the mummified body recreated the features of the dead to make them recognizable to the gods. But this mask is different. It was made to be worn by the living, and we know this because of the very distinctive eye holes, which you can see there, and this would allow the wearer to see around them. You can imagine when this was applied to the face, fastened on, tied on behind the head, it would transform that individual into a completely different entity. Traces of paint on the linen reveal how it might have helped the wearer embody some form of magical being. Whoever wore this was going to some effort to transform their appearance, to try and tap into the hidden forces of the gods and to control the world in which they lived. It's as if the Egyptian individual that wore this was trying to take charge of their own destiny. But the mask isn't the only evidence of magic. For in their dark ages, the Egyptians increasingly began to write out curses and spells on pots and figurines. Scrolled across one was the cursed Ihenvoy, son of Inti, a form of magic sufficiently small scale to be performed within their own homes. And one of the most graphic ways they did this was to take a piece of clay or a simple pot like this one and write upon it the thing or the person that they wanted to control. They often used red ochre because red was associated with the powers of destruction. So if I was doing this, I'd put on it the thing I'd want to stop, which are early morning calls and alarm clocks. Though you've got to imagine Egyptians from all walks of life doing this, the priest wanting to protect the pharaoh, the soldier in battle against an enemy, or simply a hated love rival, so all sorts of Egyptians could be on the receiving end of something like this, and then to activate the curse they smashed the pot. It was a symbolic act to annihilate the name of the enemy, and therefore to control that enemy. Oh, that does feel better. Not unlike voodoo, such practices are found in many ancient cultures, and Egypt was no exception, but it's far from the way we imagine the formal time-honored rituals of the temple led by the king at the head of the religious hierarchy. This is an Egypt that's becoming more suspicious, more fearful, and more aware of the threats to their world, natural disasters, political breakdown, and foreign powers. And this little wax figurine is a means to control anyone that threatens the balanced order of Egyptian life. Welcome to the age of fear, a time when every element of Egypt's worldview was in doubt. Their faith in their king, in their land, and even in their gods had all faltered. This is one of the lowest points in Egypt's long story, and its effect reverberated throughout the Nile Valley. The king, traditionally based in the north, was no longer the source of wealth, so royal officials abandoned court and relocated back to their hometowns throughout the country. Disunited Egypt reverted back to how it had been 1,000 years earlier, breaking up into a series of local regions called nomes, and now a new kind of leader emerges to dominate the Dark Ages. No longer a single king, but multiple warlords, and we know much about one of them because he left his detailed autobiography in his rock-cut tomb at Marala, well away from the usual tourist sites. His name was Enki. Now Enki is a small-time official who's worked his way up through the ranks to become the regional governor, or nomarch as it's known, and in the decline in central government, the power vacuum that opens up is now filled by the antiphizes of this world. Antiphi's tomb is quite modest by ancient Egyptian standards, but its interior walls tell of his rise to power, and Egyptologist Gary Shaw is going to help me unravel Antiphi's story. You can see the man himself, the great man carved standing there. He got a great hairstyle he does that is lovely. I'm liking him already, yeah. The man himself. He has a great tomb as well. The hieroglyphs and images that fill the walls reveal how Enki exploited the power vacuum at the end of the Pyramid Age, reducing the king to nothing more than a footnote. The only time you see the name of a king in the entire tomb is right here, this tiny little carto. It couldn't be any smaller. Look at the size of that. This is Neferkare. And that's it, is that it in the old tomb. The old tomb, one mention of a king. And just I think that really emphasizes just how important he thought he was alone. He didn't need to mention the pharaoh. He didn't need to say, that the king told me to do this, so I did this because of the king's feathers. He just did it himself. That is extraordinary. I think that Khutu alone of everything in the tomb encapsulates this whole period. Kings have been reduced to something on a minuscule level, and the local rulers are shown on a huge scale, and it's all about them, isn't it? Enki had enhanced his own political career and wanted to ensure the gods were in no doubt as to his importance, so the elaborate language, once exclusive to the king, was now part of Antiphi's own boastful propaganda. This warlord was an egomaniac. He also says that he's a hero without equal, without peer, and you get that here. I'm a hero without peer, and pretty much almost every inscription in this tomb ends or includes this statement at some point inside. And what did he do to kind of justify these claims? He emphasizes all the good things he did for the people. This was meant to be a time of drought and famine, so we're told in the texts, and he tried to guide them through this is managing it by feeding everybody and doing all sorts of good things, giving bread to the hungry, ointment to those without ointment, and sandals for those who were barefoot, and wives for those without wives. So it's basically telling us about a time of turmoil, yeah. But he's probably just over-exaggerating, because the more he exaggerates just how awful it is, the more great he looks when he says, well, these are the nice things I did for everybody. And you get this here. He talks about the entire South are dying from hunger. Look at that's a really graphic hieroglyph. I love that. The guy fallen over, yeah. He's definitely dead. But then it gets even worse that it says that every single man is eating his children. He didn't allow this to happen in his nome, of course, where he lived everything was fine. And at the same time, he's also a fantastic warrior. We're told over here inevitably. How did I know that was coming? Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. That these texts on this particular column talk about his abilities as a warrior. In his biggest boast of all, Ankafi, the local hero, almost claims the status of a god. I am the beginning and the end of mankind, since nobody like myself existed before, nor will he exist in Egypt's Dark Age. Warlords like Ankhtifi had replaced the real kings of Egypt, and Ankhif's delusions of grandeur, so vividly expressed inside his tomb, are even more emphasized on the outside, because he chose burial inside a rock shaped like a natural pyramid. He wanted to be the local pharaoh, and in a way he was, because whoever fed and protected the people also led the people. But as the power of warlords like Ankhti grew, so did the conflicts between them, and over time, as they either defeated their neighbors or formed alliances with them, two separate dynasties of warlord kings emerged, one in the north at Heracleopolis, where they wore the red crown of Lower Egypt, and one in the south at Thebes, symbolized by the white crown of Upper Egypt. Egypt was a divided kingdom of two lands, and between them lay a war zone. Situated at its center lay Egypt's most sacred site, its earliest royal burial ground, and still today an evocative and atmospheric place. This was the resting place of Egypt's first kings, whose mummified bodies were buried in elaborate burial chambers beneath the desert floor, a safe place for their souls, or so they thought. But hostilities between the two warring factions were about to plumb new depths of horror with an assault so blasphemous it would change the face of Egypt forever. One of the most violent acts was recorded in later texts as the vile deed for the northern warlord kings fighting their southern opponents. Here actually desecrated these royal tombs for their troops, set fire to the tombs, and destroyed the royal mummies at a stroke. Egypt's physical link to its ancient past was severed. Such an act of desecration was completely unimaginable, and the Egyptian people were rightly appalled. Although the northern kings deeply regretted what their troops had done, the destruction was irreversible, and the origins of Egypt's royal past last forever. Of course, the problem with such times of destruction is that there's very little left of them for us Egyptologists to find, but clues to remain if you know what you're looking for today. What's left of the violation of this royal burial ground is surprising: thousands upon thousands of broken pots. Although most are not part of the destruction itself, they represent centuries of atonement for the loss of Egypt's physical connection with its past. Now, not long after the desecration, this became a place of pilgrimage where people came with little pots like this, one filled with food, drink, incense, which they offered up to the souls of the dead kings once buried here. It was believed that at death, these souls of the kings had joined with the soul of Osiris, god of the dead, and as this place became a site of pilgrimage, it's as if the people of Egypt were trying to make amends for the desecration of the past. Egypt's spiritual connection to its royal ancestors was all it had left after the northern warlords had destroyed their physical remains, and the desecration soon provoked violent retaliation directly across the desert. From Abydos lay Thebes, the stronghold of the southern warlords, and they would soon rise up against their northern rivals and attempt to resurrect Egypt as a united land. Back in 2000 BC, Thebes was a one-donkey town, and yet its warlords had two distinct advantages over other leaders. They lived on a bend in the Nile called Akenna Bend, a strategic control point of rich farmland, and their local god was Monto, the god of war. The warlords of Thebes would reunite Egypt, and one in particular came to the fore. His images were carved into the walls of his Theban tomb complex, and his name tells as much. This is the Theban warlord Montotip. And there's a real clue as to what was happening at this part of Egyptian history, because his name Montotip means the local war god. Montu is content, because Hotep simply means content and happy. So if the war god was happy with Montotip, this means that he was a very powerful
military figure, and this is a wonderful scene. There are a lot of little clues here to tell us what's going on, and if you look really closely, you can see hands embracing him, flanking him at his back, at his front, around his middle. He's being embraced by the gods, chief amongst whom is Mont himself, and there he is. He's nose tonus with the king. He's given him the breath of life and infusing him with his own divine power. It was the power of victory, one that finally brought an end to Egypt's first dark age. Monty really did live up to his name as a true son of the war god, because he took his armies north, he conquered the north, and he reunited Egypt. But best of all, he's got the red crown on, and this is the red crown of the north, because Montip is declaring to the world, I might be a southerner, I might be from Thebes, I should be wearing the white crown, but look at me. Now I have the red crown, I am the king of the north, I'm the king of the south, and I have reunited Egypt as Egypt's new king. He became Montotep II, but his victory came at a high price. The grim details of what his soldiers went through can be found on Thebes' west bank at Deir el-Bak. It was inside one of the tombs. Here that the remains of Montotep's warriors were uncovered in 1923, their bodies silent witnesses to Egypt's civil war of 40 years ago, which careful analysis revealed in fascinating detail. Now, the archaeologists found around 60 bodies in the tomb, and these are the original excavation photographs. All of them have been naturally preserved, naturally mummified in the hot, dry climate, so you've still got the skin and the hair and crucially evidence of how these men had fought and died. Some of these bodies have been pierced by arrows. This one goes right into the left side of the chest. Others had actually been buried with these leather wrist guards that archers used. 10 of the warriors had been killed with ebony-tipped arrows, but in others, the wounds are even more brutal. You can see here somebody's hit this man on the head with a real whack, and you could see this very, very graphic area of damage there, and after these series of furious blows have been rained down on these poor guys, they lay helpless on the field of battle. Their bodies picked at by vultures. You can see here the dreadful damage. It's such a profound image. The bodies reveal evidence of the weapons used against them as they fought for control of Egypt. Arrows, slingshot, and even rocks had been hurled at the warriors from above. Eventually their bodies were collected from the battlefield and carefully wrapped in linen. This linen bore the insignia of the Theban tomb complex belonging to their leader Montip. But just as significant as the bodies themselves was where Montip chose to bury his fallen heroes today. The warrior's resting place is a little-known sealed tomb, but for 0 years ago, Montip honored his dead soldiers with a burial amongst the graves of his highest officials, making them part of his monument to victory the new king had created. What could well be the world's first known war cemetery now, I'm lucky enough to have been given special permission to see Monthotep's soldiers for the first time. These guys are going to be taking down the tomb wall for me, allowing me to actually meet the very people who fought in Egypt's civil war around 2000 BC, so I am very, very excited, and it was the same curiosity which drove a team of American archaeologists to excavate their original mass grave in the first place. Now reburied in a neighboring tomb, the bodies of Monthotep's soldiers have rarely seen the light of day since their discovery over 90 years ago now. This is really super frustrating, but in the interest of health and safety, I can't go in there immediately, much as I really want to, because all the stale air is built up as the wall's being sealed, and we've really got to let this out with all the fungal spores and the bacteria and everything else that's so detrimental to health. Early Egyptologists tended to rush straight in and risk the so-called Pharaoh's curse, so a little waiting is essential. I can't believe we're actually going to enter this tomb. Now it's one of those rare moments you get in an Egyptological career into a tomb that's hardly ever visited. The wall had to come down, and who knows what we're going to find inside, because I certainly have never seen this before, so it's a very special moment. This literally wasn't at all what I expected. Nobody knew what to expect. It's staggering. I've never ever been into a tomb quite like this before. The mask is a very good idea because there's all sorts of things floating around in the atmosphere in here, not just the dust of ages, but the dust of human beings, and as such we have to be very respectful. It's a large rock cut tomb, and although its walls are unfinished, it's typical of those created for courtiers and officials throughout these cliffs. Wow, it's a mummy fire body. It's absolutely incredible. Oh, that's quite something. And if you look along the length of this very long tomb, look at the floor. This isn't stone. These are human remains and mummy wrappings, and there are chambers and corridors leading off again full of wrappings, the linen of ages. Some of it is claimed to be the very linen that bound the bodies of Monthotep's warriors to help preserve them for eternity, but at first glance, it's hard to get a clear picture, for this particular tomb seems to have been reused many times during Egypt's long history. Part of his shoulder, you see the way the skin's folded and dried out, partial human body still, with much of its soft tissue intact. It hits you immediately in the face, and you're confronted with what a tomb is all about. Make no mistake, this is the home of the dead, and we're in amongst them. It's a very emotive and powerful place to be, but what's striking is how little is left of their bodies. Like many other tombs up and down the Nile, they've been subjected to centuries of looting and damage, and amongst all these linen wrappings and debris and human remains themselves are the tangible remains of these men who died so bravely in their efforts to reunify Egypt. For Montip, their leader, having just come out of that tomb, of very mixed emotions. I don't really know what I was expecting to see. Certainly some of Montip's soldiers, perhaps, some of them, where it's highly likely. Essentially what we're looking at are the ancient Egyptians themselves. These are the ancient Egyptians' temples, tombs, pyramids. This wonderful culture, it's all well and good studying these esoteric aspects that are distinct and marvelous and grand, but when it comes down to it, things we should really be interested in are these people. Montip's reunification of Egypt marked a new beginning, the dawn of what would become known as the Middle Kingdom and the rise of Thebes. Montip made it the new spiritual heart of Egypt, and it would stay that way for the next 2 years. But whereas the war god Montu had dominated the previous century of Egypt's story, the deity that now took center stage was Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, beauty, and motherhood, the goddess whose origins can be traced right back to the earliest of times. And believing that Hathor dwelt in the cliffs of Deir el-Bak, Montip chose this site not only for his war cemetery, but for his own tomb complex. It was Montip that first built here in this dramatic place where the cliffs Meet the desert believed to be the home of the goddess Hathor herself. It was a fast track to the afterlife, and for Monteotep and his men who had lived and died by the war god Monto, they all now rest in the eternal embrace of Hathor. The first to build at Deir al-Bachi was Monty, the founder of a reunified Egypt. He was so influential that almost 600 years later, female pharaoh Hatshepsut built her own temple right next door to tap into the religious and political power of her illustrious predecessor. In the Middle Kingdom, life for ordinary people was on the up. Food was plentiful, wealth and trade flourished, and farming was revitalized with new irrigation systems. Yet the Dark Age had nonetheless left its mark on the Egyptian mindset as revealed in the way they prepared for the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, tomb walls were often covered in elaborate scenes and texts, replicating an idealized version of the Egyptian world. But in the Dark Ages, people had seen their sacred sites ripped apart, so instead of such many in the Middle Kingdom opted for its cheaper equivalent with something much smaller and much more intimate. While these may look like children's toys, they were in fact made nearly 4,000 years ago to be placed inside Egyptian burials. Now these wooden models were designed to provide the deceased with an eternal supply of food and drink in the next world. And so we have all the basics here, the Egyptian staples of bread, beer, and beef. So we have the bakers at this end, and they're grinding the grain to make flour, which will then be made into the bread. Loaves that are cooked in this fire, and the baker is in front there. The arms are quite damaged, but presumably face from the heat, as we know from other examples. Move to the middle, and we have the butcher here, and he's cutting the throat of this ox, and the legs are bound here to keep the animal in situ while the deed is done. And then we move on to the end, and we have the brewer. This is a fabulous example, because he's pushing the mash through a sea, and the sea's even being drawn on there. On the top, actually, in proportion with the rest of it, this individual's ordered rather more beer than either bread or beef, because this section of the model is almost half its length, but you can see the vats of beer carefully laid on their side. It's a wonderfully evocative piece. These people have been working for 4,000 years. They're still at it. Look at them. The key elements of Egyptian culture were back, and they look little different from times of plenty in the previous millennium. Look at this busy crew grappling with the sail poles, ready to launch the boat off the Nile's banks, and this granary silo inside workers haul sacks of barley while a scribe counts the crop. And of course, there are also female figures in Egypt. Women enjoyed much the same status as men, unlike their sisters in many other parts of the ancient world. They're also producing one of the Egyptian staples, but linen, the cloth, which was used to make pretty much every Egyptian garment. When you see this standing woman here, she's spinning the thread with this spindle, and the thread that she's busy making, she then hand on to her 2 companions, here the weavers, and they're using this horizontal loom that's pegged to the ground to produce the bolts of cloth, which will be fashioned into the wraparound dresses, the kilts, the loincloths, as worn by pretty much every ancient Egyptian man, woman, and child. The lives depicted in these busy little scenes are the comfortable and the familiar, representing the Egyptian idea of security. This isn't Takarma's death mask. This isn't the finest piece of art you'll ever see, but that isn't the point. These are real people doing real jobs. This is ancient Egypt up close, and personal order had been restored within Egypt, but the fears that once tore Egypt apart hadn't disappeared entirely. For now, they were projected outwards to the world beyond its borders. So Middle Kingdom monarchs like Stern, old Sesisteris, 3 focused on national security and wealth creation. Sesostris is infamous for his devastating military campaign south into Goldric, Nubia, but he also opted for a more permanent kind of control by building castles. Now this is a map of southern Egypt and Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan, and where Aswan is, that was the border between the two, and Egypt maintained its control over Nubia through a series of forts, with around 8 of these built by Sesostris himself. These Middle Kingdom forts were within signaling distance of one another along the southern Nile down into Nubia. They were all part of a massive state-building program designed to subjugate the local population and maintain the flow of goods and people up into Egypt, particularly Nubian gold. Very few of these forts still survive. These are some of the last images ever recorded of the largest at Bun. It was filmed in 1962, during its excavation and after the creation of the Aswan Dam. These massive mud brick walls disappeared forever beneath the waters of the new Lake Nasser, but Bowen isn't completely lost to us, because the excavation records are kept here at the Egypt Exploration Society, and they reveal an unexpected aspect of Middle Kingdom Egypt, as well as photographs they hold. Architectural plans of the fort drawn up during the excavations, giving a real insight into the immense scale of the Egyptian crackdown in Nubia. Hi Chris, hi Joe, how are you? I'm well, thank you God. This looks like an amazing photograph. What does it actually show? Well, this is an aerial photograph, Joe, so what we can see here, along the bottom, this strip is actually the River Nile, and then right on the banks of the Nile, emerging from the sand here, we see this square outline of the massive fortification of the site of Bun. But once the excavators began to uncover the full extent of what we could see, this is what they came across that just looks like a medieval castle. Doesn't it very rarely do you think ancient Egypt, oh yeah, castles, and yet here is the evidence in front of us, absolutely designed to keep the enemy out. Bun shares features with the castles of Europe, but all constructed 3,000 years earlier. The most astonishing of all is its sheer size. There's a little scale on this map, gives you an idea this is roughly 100 meters. So just the Nile-facing wall here is well over 400 meters long. If you think about the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, that's 200 meters along the base, so we're talking about the length of 2 Great Pyramids along here. The total circumference of this wall is well over a mile, and the walls, these outer walls, are 11 meters high inside, which you could fit around 20 football pitchers, because as well as controlling the Nubian gold supply, Egypt intended to rule by intimidation. This is the Middle Kingdom's great monumental architectural statement: pyramids, monumental tombs. Were not really the kinds of buildings they needed. What they very much needed were these heavily fortified fortress towns to guard the frontier of their territory. When this fortress arrives in the barren, empty desert landscape in the Middle Kingdom, this would have been a massive statement. Something very, very big, powerful, strong, scary has suddenly arrived in the desert. So anybody traveling from Nubia north into Egypt has to sail past this, and this would have taken quite a while to sail past, wouldn't it? Absolutely, yes. Imagine looking up, you're in a little boat on the Nile, and you're looking up and up and up and up, and you can see all these arrow slits. People training their arrows, perhaps. Or you know you're being watched. It's that big brother mentality, isn't it exactly? Rising up by the Nile button was a gleaming citadel of power, but most of all, it was an early warning system, the eyes and ears of a nation defined by suspicion and fear. But Egypt's southern border wasn't the only one to be fortified. The northeastern border with Palestine was also secured with such defenses to monitor the large number of foreign traders regularly traveling to sell their goods in super wealthy Egypt. In the visit of one such group is portrayed here on a tomb wall, a caravan of wealthy merchants and their families, clearly not Egyptian, with their distinctive hairstyles and brightly colored clothes, known as the Armu people. They traded in such goods as the black leather vital for Egypt's production of eye makeup, and their distinctive pottery has been found across the Nile Delta, where many of them settled to live and work among the Egyptians. But within a century, some of these Armu had infiltrated high office and eventually took over Egypt itself. Now these nomadic armored people who came in and out of Egypt on a regular basis to trade are portrayed here in this wonderful tomb scene. And yet the most important part of the entire scenario are 3 small hieroglyphs right in the middle. They reveal one of the other terms the Egyptians used to name the Armu. It's basically a crook, a scepter, and that's written with 2 symbols, and that's pronounced Heka. It means ruler, and then the third of the 3 symbols is kind of undulating uplands, which means desert or hill country. Basically, the Egyptians used this symbol to denote a foreign land, so you put these signs together, ruler of foreign lands, and this really is the clue to what happened next, because these Armu of Palestinian origin eventually became the Hyksos. The Hekahasset are the Hyksos, and they ruled Egypt from the north between 1650 and 1550 BC. But as tension between the foreign rulers and their Egyptian subjects gradually escalated, Egypt entered a second dark age. The Hyksos made an alliance with the Nubians to the south, and the Egyptians found themselves trapped between 2 enemies, although we know little of this difficult time. Some fascinating texts do survive. Perhaps the most compelling are the words of a royal letter sent by the Hyksos kings south to Thebes. Its message would prove so explosive that it galvanized the Theons to once more regain control of their land. Now this letter was either a colossal diplomatic faux power or simply downright rudeness, and it involved the Egyptian goddess Tarwar. The pugnacious blade-wielding Hippoteret may have been a protective deity, but she was also a ferocious creature with features borrowed from the hippo and the crocodile animals the Egyptians feared so. It seems the Hyksos king Aos set out deliberately to insult the Theons. Now the letter to Kesti, form of a complaint in which Apis is basically complaining that the bellowing of the sacred hippos in Thebes is keeping him awake at night. Expel the hippopotami from the lake. They do not allow me to sleep day or night because their noise is in my ear. Now many have taken this to be a rather eccentric comment, but I think it actually alludes to the powerful women of Thebes. It seems that Apis is actually comparing the wife of the leader with the feisty hippo goddess herself, and soon it would be the Theons who would decide that the Hyksos had had their day. They had to go. And soon this war of words had escalated into armed conflict between the 2 powers, but the Egyptians of Thebes had also gained the means to launch their attack with something developed by the Hyksos themselves. State-of-the-art weaponry, in particular a new kind of bow, known today as the composite bow. It would revolutionize Egyptian warfare. Wasn't it a lovely shape? It's a beautiful thing. This may look like a bow made of solid wood, similar to those the Egyptians had always used, but the secret of the composite bow is all down to the elements within its composite, because it's made out of different materials. all joined together. So there's a wooden core form in the center of the bow, but inside the curve, on the belly of the bow, is horn, glued onto the wood, which forms a really powerful spring, so the heart, the cow horn, will go there, yeah, that's right, on the inside of the curve. And then on the outside of the curve, an even more unpromising material, sinew, which horrid looks like something the cat would enjoy, and there's all covered over with birch bark to protect the glue from the elements. Before the Hyksos occupation, the Egyptians had shot arrows from bows carved from solid wood. They were quite large, unwieldy, and only effective at fairly close range. But in the composite bow, animal horn added flexibility and the sinew strength. It's a clever combination of ingredients, isn't it? Making it the ultimate in ancient archery. It just asks you to do that, doesn't it? It does. It's fabulous. There's a real sense of power behind this, isn't there? It's a beautiful thing. Let me show you. So this is why it's such a game changer, really, because it's a bow that you can use. It's quite short. You can use it in a chariot, and yet, whoa, that was brilliant. Well done. The composite bow was easier to handle and shot faster arrows with much greater accuracy. The Egyptians had little choice but to adapt or remain an occupied nation. So by copying the new military technology, they were eventually able to push the Hyksos out of Egypt, all the way back to Palestine, securing Egypt's northern frontier once again. And when the new bow was used in conjunction with the other Hyksos introductions, the horse and chariot, the three combined to express the power and supremacy of Egypt's new Egyptian rulers. This marked the start of the new kingdom, which began when the powerful Theban leaders took the throne. This dramatic rebirth in royal power was mirrored by the rise of Thebes' local god, a moon based at his cult center, the Temple of Karnak, and it would be a moon who now protected Egypt and its kings. Yet thanks to the Hyksos legacy, these were a new kind of king, and it's on this temple's walls we can clearly see the effect of the Hyksos occupation. For as Pharaoh smites his enemies, this is Egypt reborn, a fully armed, fully charged superpower whose kings shown on a monumental scale are superheroes. Over some 800 years since the Pyramid Age, Egypt's story had been one of upheaval, collapse. Finally, rebirth. The Egyptians had reclaimed their culture and entered a truly golden age. Hundreds of tons of stone to portray a mighty pharaoh, colossal testament to Egypt's golden age. I think it's probably here at the feet of the Colossia of Menin. Get a real sense of who Amenhotep III was. In my opinion, Amenhotep III was ancient Egypt's greatest pharaoh. He presided over the zenith of Egyptian culture and civilization. He is the golden age. He is the epitome of everything that made ancient Egypt brilliant. The rise of this great civilization was powered by its extraordinary belief system, where the pursuit of the perfect afterlife was everything capable of withstanding disasters and dark ages, to then re-emerge as the most powerful empire in the ancient world. In this episode, I'm going to enter what I regard as Egypt's greatest era, the New Kingdom. Whoa, what an amazing chamber, a time of luxury, grand designs, and unparalleled splendor. Isn't this absolutely beautiful? But like all good things, it couldn't last forever. Egypt's powerful religion would prove to be its greatest weakness, and I'll discover how the priests became so rich, their power struggle with the crown destroyed the very unity of Egypt. It was this very conflict that would transform this golden age into one of decadence and corruption, and would eventually tear Egypt apart. And by looking again at Egypt's greatest superstars, I'm going to investigate what really happened during the glittering New Kingdom. Welcome to my story of ancient Egypt. Applause. The New Kingdom, nearly 3,500 years ago, in the time of Amenhotep III, when Egypt's expression of power and belief reached new heights of enormity. I've joined an the team of archaeologists who are excavating just one of the vast monuments Amenhotep created, his Ori Temple. Now being here, you really get a sense of what it must have been like 3,500 years ago when this place was a building site much as it is today. All these statues all around Amenhotep's image coming up in their hundreds, and yet, as the archaeologists today assemble all these pieces, this is literally history coming out of the ground piece by piece. In the pyramid age royal tombs and Ori temples were a single complex, but 1,300 years later the two were built separately, reflecting a new era of opulence, epitomizing the greatest dynasty of all, the 18th, the time of Amenhotep III. For centuries, pretty much the only visible remains of Amenhotep's temple were his two colossal statues. Now archaeologist Dr. Hurik Sarujan and her team are finally uncovering the full splendor of this once mighty monument. You touch, and it's like glass. Yeah, covering over 86 acres. This was not a tomb like the pyramids, but a huge complex, the largest estuary temple ever created. It's a massive, unbelievable. You have to imagine this is only the major temple, the main temple. You have to imagine other temples, processional ways, sphinx, avenues, magazines, workshops, treasures, pools, gardens, priest house, administrative houses. All this was a big city in the in the capital, overwhelming in size. This grand design was built as the place where his soul could be ripped for eternity, while his mummified body was buried in the Valley of the Kings nearby. But during his lifetime inside the temple, a permanent priesthood was employed, all ruled over by the pharaoh Amenhotep's massive statues. Flanked the temple's main entrance beyond them lay a second pair, and then a third. Amenhotep's image repeated throughout the temple complex. I wish one day they find a time machine, I go back. Can I come? I'll come with you. We may not have a time machine, but 15 years of work have begun to reveal some of the temple's former glories. Normally these would have been meters up in the air, but to actually engage, it's so very tactile, so very intimate, holding hands with the pharaoh. This colossus from the temple's second gateway is flanked by one of the best preserved statues of Amenhotep's principal consort, Queen Tai, his great royal wife, here standing, and by miracle, having been saved by all the catastrophes which struck this temple. So he's protected her for centuries, really, hasn't he? Carved to be no bigger than Amenhotep's lower leg, Queen Tai's size served to exaggerate the pharaoh's superhuman status. These massive statues were more than a memorial, each worshipped to guarantee the immortality of the king's soul, the pharaoh as god. This is my great surprise to you, and Hurrig has saved the very best till last dress. Oh, flipping out, it's Amenhotep's head at 3 meters tall, carved from the finest white alabaster. Oh, don't know what to say. Over the years, I've seen many of his portraits, but rarely one as stunning as this. Look at it. Look at his nose. This is an absolutely amazing portrait, sculpted face of Amenhotep himself. Never seen anything like it. With hundreds of statues like this, Amenhotep was multiplying the image of himself as Egypt's most powerful god, bringing light and life to the world, because whoever controlled Egypt's religion controlled Egypt, and with it a vast amount of wealth now. Amenhotep wore gold from top to toe, and he handed it out to his courtiers as gifts, but he also used it as a diplomatic weapon. Amenhotep's clever use of Egyptian gold is recorded on stone scarabs like this one. They served as the pharaoh's news bulletins, which he circulated around his empire with updates inscribed on their base. In this case, it was a new marriage of the king. It effectively records his marriage to a Syrian princess, a princess from the land of Mitanni, and it recounts how, having sent gold to the princess's father, he then sent out one of his daughters for the pharaoh to marry. So a kind of mail-order bride. If you like, it reports that her name was Killer Heaper, and that she arrived from Mitanni in Syria with no fewer than 317 ladies in waiting. Clearly impressed, Amenhotep added the comment, "It's a marvel." With this diplomatic marriage, only one of many, they were an effective way of securing peace and prosperity. Amenhotep was able to utilize his key resource, his gold, to kind of get everything he wanted to maintain his status as the supreme monarch. In the ancient world at that time, gold bought Egypt peace with its neighbors, with Amenhotep III's empire stretching from what is now Syria as far as modern Sudan. But within Egypt itself, gold had a different use and could even guarantee a fast track to the afterlife, emphatically expressed by a great treasure in the museum in Wigan, a stunning golden face. Originally part of a woman's coffin, her Lee-like features were preserved to allow her soul to recognize her in the afterlife. Isn't this absolutely beautiful? Clearly, the gold suggests to us that this was someone of very special, very high status, very wealthy, although we can never know her name. She had clearly spent a fortune in preparing for her perfect afterlife, covered in gold leaf. She stares out at us with eyes of alabaster and black obsidian. We can really see into the world, into the thought patterns of the Egyptians themselves, because, as stunning as this face is, it was simply buried in a tomb, literally buried in a hole in the ground, not for human eyes but to be seen by the gods and the spirits of the dead with whom this woman wanted to join. And that's why her skin is gold, because the gods had golden skin, and she wanted to be recognized by them as one of their own, taken into their eternal care. For the Egyptians, it was a special pact between themselves and the gods that made their country, made their empire so very powerful, so very special. In the Golden Age, this special pact shone more brightly than ever before, with Egypt's wealth poured into their faith in the afterlife, and with increasing amounts of gold accompanying the royal mummies. Their tombs needed to be kept secure at all costs, so a secret burial place was established for Egypt's pharaohs on Thebes, West Bank, the Valley of the Kings. It was essential that each royal mummy was buried safely in their tomb, in a custom dating back to the beginning of time, because each one became a royal ancestor whose cumulative souls formed the very essence of Egypt. The royal tombs had been desecrated once before, breaking Egypt's spiritual link to its ancestors. So to prevent this happening again, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom chose burial deep in this remote valley where they could lie undisturbed in rock-cut tombs, and this became Egypt's most sacred place. Such elaborate preparations for the afterlife also fueled a growing economy, and just as in the Pyramid Age, the industry of death shaped the lives of many ordinary Egyptians, for not only were their tombs to cut and temples to build, but statues, shrines, coffins, sarcophagi, and all the paraphernalia of the afterlife. And with this came all the ingenuity of sourcing everything from alabaster to granite to gold. This is a copy of the world's earliest surviving geological map dating from around 1150 BC and the reign of Ramses IV. This map is a guide to the stone quarries and gold mines of a 15-kilometer stretch of Egypt's eastern desert. It's almost as detailed as a modern geological map with different colors for the different rock types. So over here, these large areas of black are the sedimentary rocks back. Here where it turns pink, these are the igneous rocks. Like granite, other little features include areas of gold mining. And then throughout, you have this very subtle speckling, and these are the areas of gravel known to be very accurate. The map was made for one specific quarrying expedition when 80 men were sent into a desert valley 130 kilometers, from Thebes to Mindstone for royal monuments. But what's special about this map is that it leads us to the ordinary. People who were employed by the pharaoh to build the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It was discovered by archaeologists at the workers' village of Dar, Medina, a purpose-built settlement to house the tomb builders, architects, artists, and scribes, together with their families. This would have been a bustling place, its streets, full of children playing, deliveries being made, and all the colors, sounds, and smells of everyday life. It's one of the workers who lived here who made the map. Now we even know the identity of the map maker. The scribe Ammon, his distinctive handwriting, is well known from a range of other literary works, from poems to prayers, maps to tomb plants, and it's thanks to one particular little inscription with his name on that we even know where he lived. Amenact lived here. This is the scribe's house. Amenact was one of the many skilled workers that rose through the ranks of society in the generations. Following the reign of Amenhotep III, he became the head scribe of this entire village. So a very, very important man, and yet it's a very sad tale as well, because as he gets older we know that his eyesight started to fail, because a prayer of his has survived in which he makes this very personal address to the local goddess, Merit, Seeger, who lived at the top of the mountain up there. And he's imploring the goddess. He's saying, my eyesight is failing. I see darkness by day, and for a scribe, for a consummate draftsman like Amenact, how sad that would have been here. Amenact prays to Merit Seeger, both of them symbolically portrayed. Without their eyes, it's hard not to resist this image that as he got older and more infirm, he would have gone up the steps to the flat roof, with failing eyesight, try to focus on the job in hand, trying to mix his paints, apply the lines and the words and so forth, and needing the full sun on a day like this just to get through the working day. But just like his predecessors who built the pyramids, Amenact would have felt a sense of greater purpose. We can imagine him and his neighbors in Dar Medina working towards a single aim, creating the royal tomb, the new kingdom. Pharaohs had created a new image for themselves, elaborate building schemes requiring new towns full of workers, a strong economy supporting an ever grander vision, both for this world and the next. But the spiritual convictions that had brought Egypt to its zenith had also created a serious threat in the new kingdom. Much of the Egyptian state centered on Thebes, while its west bank was mainly dedicated to its city of the dead. The east bank was where most people lived, and the site of Egypt's main state temple Kerak. As Kerak was rapidly becoming the largest religious complex of the ancient world, its influence grew exponentially, and likewise, the power of its priests. To get a real sense of what's going on, we need to go behind the scenes. I'm being allowed through an ancient passageway, once only accessible to Kerak's clergy. From the top, more and more wonderful sign, it leads to the top of the temple's main gateway and gives a view of Kerak. Not many get to see, just look at that. You could fit NRA, AM, and St. Paul's cathedrals in here and still have acres to spare. It is immense within. Karnak, a series of chapels, shrines, and sacred precincts, covered a total area of more than 250 acres. This was Egypt's religious heart for almost 20 years. The reason why Kerak is so vast is that every pharaoh poured so much of their wealth into this temple. Their gold and their spoils of war all filled the temple's coffers, and each pharaoh also wanted to build their own halls, shrines, and obelisks in an attempt to outdo their predecessors, and yet all to the greater glory of Karnak's chief god Amun. Over the course of centuries, Amun had risen from a local Theban god to Egypt's state deity, and his worship was the engine that fueled the nation. So every pharaoh had to keep Amun content, offering him their wealth and tending to his every need. And this privilege fell to Kerak's high priest and was performed in the temple's inner sanctum, secret ceremonies at which the only others permitted were the royals. Here we are in the very heart of Kerak Temple. This is where the god lived. The god himself lived inside his sacred statue. The original wouldn't have been much bigger than this, would have been solid gold. It would have lived inside a little golden shrine sealed by a pair of small doors. Each morning the high priest would come in. He would awaken the god's spirit. He would greet him. He would wash him, anoint him with perfume, apply his eye makeup, and then dress him in various linen outfits, apply the small pieces of jewelry to the god's statue, and then the god would proceed to enjoy his day. Amun received daily meals of the finest foods, roast meats, bread, fruit, and vegetables, accompanied by wine and beer. Clouds of incense would drive away evil forces, and musicians and dancers entertained him. And by keeping their most important deity, content, it was believed that a moon would in turn make the Nile flood each year, make the sun rise each morning, and maintain Egypt's supreme status. The high priest's direct access to a moon made them the greatest beneficiaries of Karnech's growing prosperity. This tranquil lake is where the male and female clergy bathed twice each day and night to maintain their ritual purity before the gods known as the Pure Ones. They set themselves apart from the rest of society with their distinctive appearance achieved through their own set of daily rituals. Part of this process of ritual purity involved using an array of implements on a daily basis to transform their appearance. And one of the most important things they did, they had to remove all body hair, male and female. Clergy using razors like this, so every day having to shave their heads and their entire bodies, keep them free from lice, and all these kind of things which would have inhibited their sense of cleanliness. It was essential that they also had a very clean mouth because they'd be speaking the words before the god. And so they used something which is quite a modern thing, basically natron salt, a kind of bicarbonate, rather like a modern bicarbonate toothpaste, which would get their teeth nice and clean, scrupulous. Not only with dental hygiene, they wore reed woven sandals, and robes of pure white linen, and having transformed themselves in this wonderful way, they also had access to these polished metal mirrors. They could then admire their transformed appearance because it was important to distance themselves from the great unwashed. For the ancient priests, cleanliness really was next to godliness, and they were the God's chosen people. As the wealth and power of Karach's priests grew, their authority over Egypt began to rival that of the king. Karach's priests had pharaohic influence active, not only by day but also by night. One of these priests was called Nacht. He was a priest of the hours of a moon, which basically means he was an astronomer, and he would sit by night on the flat temple roof, which was effectively an ancient observatory, and he'd be able to chart the progress of the stars and planets in the sky, watch the movement of the heavens, and by doing so, the priests of Egypt were able to work out when to celebrate specific events. But of course, what this meant is that Karach never closed. It was a 24-hour-a-day concern. It meant the priests were always there. It meant the priests were always watching, fully aware of the potential threat posed by the Karach clergy. Amenhotep III employed his own relatives in the temple to guarantee their loyalty, but such subtle means of control were about to evaporate. Enter a new pharaoh, Akhenaten, son and heir of Amenhotep. But unlike his father, Akhenaten was no diplomat. His zealous ambitions would soon plunge Egypt into an age of political and religious extremism early in his reign. Akhenaten found a swift way to stamp his authority on the priests by building a controversial new temple complex at Karach. Now what we're looking at here is something very, very unusual. It's part of a wall from Karach Temple, but not the traditional part of Karnak Temple. It's a section that was built a little way beyond, and it was a new revolutionary building. It wasn't built like the old-style Karnak in huge, big monolithic blocks of stone, but these small, easier-to-handle blocks, which meant, of course, it could almost spring up overnight. But most shocking of all were the images that this new temple portrayed. Akhenaten had begun to dismantle Egypt's traditional religion and replaced its many deities with a single god. If you look very carefully, the images are very different to what went before. A moon is nowhere present. The god of Karuk himself isn't represented in his own temple, because the god shown here is a form of the sun god called the Artan, and you can see the multiple rays coming down, ending in human hands, giving their blessings to the main figure here. And it isn't the high priest of a moon. Pharaoh's priests were no longer in control at Karach, and the moon himself was now replaced by the Artan sun god. In fact, life in Egypt was turned on its head, and whereas previously courtiers would bow very low before their monarch, now times had changed. These people had their faces in the dirt before Pharaoh. They're lying prostrate before him. This marked the beginning of a new age. It was an age when the only way to reach God was through his intermediaries, twin monarchs, Akhenaten and his wife, and Karula Nefertiti. And when the priests objected, the royal couple closed Karach, sacked its priests, and seized its treasury. They then moved their whole court 400 kilometers downriver from Thebes, and in less than 10 years built a brand new city known today as Amarna. Its palaces, temples, and tombs were filled with images of the Artan, the sun disk god, gone, with a multiplicity of gods to worship. Now, it was the sun that was celebrated each day with hymns, prayers, and offerings presented on a truly lavish scale. But the couple's vision of utopia came at a price, and when Akhenaten died after a 17-year reign, Egypt was bankrupt. His son became king of Egypt, and although he reigned for less than 10 years, he still became the most famous pharaoh from the whole of Egyptian history, Tutankhamun. His treasure, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, was the most famous archaeological find of all time. Tutankhamun's mask is the epitome of ancient Egypt, so very familiar yet, like so many of his treasures holding a long-standing secret, I've come to Oxford University's Griffith Institute to examine the most detailed records of his burial. So, in this first stack, these are all Carter's notes, diaries, journals, and then right at the bottom down here, we've got all Harry Burton's original glass. Negatives captured on delicate glass slides. These are the original negatives taken by Howard, Carter's photographer, at every stage of the 10-year excavation. So this shows the very first view they had of the mummy. They revealed Tutankhamun's burial, in a way not usually seen, for this is the linen shroud over his third innermost coffin. This is as if the bombers have just finished. The family have laid their wreaths and floral tributes before the lid finally went on. What a privilege to actually see this in black and white. Wow, that's pretty profound. For all his fabled wealth, Tutankhamun was in life a fairly insignificant pharaoh, but his premature death after only a decade as king offered Carrick's priests the perfect opportunity to obliterate all trace of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the Amarna period, and these wonderful photos of his burial treasure reveal how they did it on his famous golden throne. Tutankhamun and his wife Ankhenamun are depicted together. But all is not what it seems. As recent research has discovered, we look at the back of the queen's head, where her wig originally was. It's been slightly cut down there. The same with Tutankhamun's crown. A new crown has been added here, so it's little things like this, because headgear regalia was crucial in identifying these royal individuals. By altering the images, the throne had been customized for Tutankhamun. But the biggest giveaway as to whom this once belonged is in the deity that looms large above the king and queen. So, although a moon is also named on this throne, it's the art and sun disk that does take center stage and really does cement this piece as a royal throne from the Amarna age. So it seems that the two figures, once believed to be Tutankhamun and his wife, were originally Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Another clue comes from the most famous artifact from ancient history. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, or is it recent research, has zoned in on one long overlooked feature, and that is the decidedly pierced ears, because it's been suggested that this mask was originally made for someone else. The research suggests that Tutankhamun wouldn't have worn earrings beyond childhood, so by the age of 20 when he died, he would not have been portrayed with pierced ears. This mask was not made for an adult male pharaoh. Indeed, when the gold has been compared, the face is made of completely different gold to the rest. Evidence of soldering is clearly visible on the mask. It now seems as if Tutankhamun's own face was effectively grafted on to the mask of a previous ruler who had pierced ears for earrings, a previous ruler who may well have been a woman, who may well have been Nefertiti. Applause. In fact, it's estimated that around 80% of the objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb originally belonged to either Akhenaten or Nefertiti, and with all of it dumped together like this, it's a kind of spiritual decluttering as far as the priests were concerned. All this was tainted gold, and so the burial of Tutankhamun was the perfect opportunity to bury the unwanted past forever while the city of Amarna had been abandoned, then demolished. The memory of everything it represented was likewise being erased. Egypt's state religion was restored. Karnak's priests were back in business, and Thebes was once again the seat of sacred power. And now, the next dynasty of the new kingdom was in control, having died without an heir. Tutankhamun was succeeded by a line of militaristic rulers, the 19th dynasty with no direct royal ancestry. The new dynasty needed to reconnect with Egypt's illustrious past, so it reinstated traditional beliefs in a renaissance, led by one of its most influential rulers, Seti. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings is the largest pharaoh's tomb ever created here. Currently close to the public, I've been given special permission to explore this labyrinthine treasure. The tomb's inviting us down, further down into the underworld, and it's just drawing us into the darkness. It's a really deep tomb. It's 174 meters of corridors and chambers, all chiseled out by hand and covered from floor to ceiling in some truly spectacular scenes. Wow, what an amazing chamber. Absolutely filled with little golden twinkly stars. But the walls of Set's tomb carry a clear message demonstrating the return of Egypt's traditional deities in full force. And here we see him, Seti, with the gods. Applause. This is a brilliant chamber. It's repeated images of the pharaoh Seti with the gods. The gods are back, and he's keen to show that. And so we see him here with Anubis, the elegant black jackal god of embalming, and the dead. Here Seti is making offerings to Hathor, the maternal goddess of love, who takes all dead souls into her care, and Horus, the god of kingship, wearing the joint crowns of upper and lower Egypt. Then Seti makes the strongest connection with Egypt's past in the portrayal of the ultimate deity in the tomb, Osiris, god of the underworld. He represents every single pharaoh that's gone before Seti. He represents the accumulated powers of the royal ancestors, and Seti is keen to show himself in the company of Osiris. He's tapping into that greatness that made Egypt such a strong nation. Every image, every hieroglyph in Set's tomb harks back to the golden age of Amenhotep III. And continuing with this golden legacy, Set, his reign was a true renaissance of art and culture, with the ultimate jewel in his tomb, his burial chamber, that is absolutely superb. This is really incredible. It's taking that nighttime sky motif and really running with it. This is the night sky, as seen through the eyes of the astronomer priests, and this is where the royal mummy would have lain in its alabaster sarcophagus, allowing Setzi's mummy set his soul to look up at this spectacular ceiling. Egypt's traditional belief system is here writ large, covering every surface. Egypt was back. Setzi had brought back the days of glory. It's as if the Amana period had never been, and for the average man and woman in the street, that was a wonderful thing because order had been restored, chaos had been brushed away, and everything was all right with their world. The golden age had been restored, but not just for the larger-than-L life, pharaohs with their glorious tombs and vast monuments, but for the majority of Egypt's population too. This included the inhabitants of Dar al-Medina, the tomb builder's village. Near the Valley of the Kings, at the edge of the village, was a great pit the community dumped inside, which were discovered tens of thousands of pieces of pottery and stone covered in pictures and words written in hieratic script, a Kindorf hieroglyphic. Shorthand, these are the ancient Egyptian equivalent of post-it notes, shopping lists, and text messages. This is the kind of stuff that speaks to everyday life. What's going on underneath the surface? With the help of hieratic expert Dr. Glenn Guy, we can catch a glimpse of this intimate world far away from kings and gods. Which is your favorite amongst these ones? I always go to this one. This is really nice because this one's basically a list of stuff you take to a party. What you've got is tabulated information, so you've got vertical and horizontal lines, and in each of those spaces, you've got a name and the stuff they brought to that particular event. I mean, this person here, the name's missing from this, but this person brought the most stuff, about 11 items. We've got bread, for example, being brought along next down. We've got some beer, so 1 jug of beer as well as beer and bread. It lists a veritable feast. Fruit, 20 pieces, beans, 1 jar full, fish meat, and even a cake. The thing I like about this is the idea of a community coming together. It really does make the ancient Egyptians that more real, because we can relate to them. We all like a good party, but of course, life isn't always a party, and people fall on hard times. This fragment begins with the story of a breakup. Hisu-Neb divorced the Lady Hel, and then it goes on to record a heartwarming story of support from its anonymous author. He seems to have wanted to look after this Lady Hel, and so the text goes on, and it says that the author of this spent 3 years giving 1 measure of MOE to Hel every month, but it doesn't end there, so she gives to the author here, I'm a sash, so a piece of clothing, and she says in this line here, to offer it at the riverbank. The riverbank is where the market was, right? And she says that she'd like 1 measure of Emma wheat for it, but no one wanted it. No, so yeah. The text goes on to say that the author tried to offer it down at the riverbank, but he gives a customer review. It's right here, 1 word, bean, which means bad, Yeah, so it wasn't even worth 1 measure of Emma. So that is sad, but the author's such a good egg he says that he buys it off of her for well over the market value of this thing that wasn't even worth 1 measure in the first place anyway. Nice guy, pity we don't know his name.
Yeah.
It's a real shame, but at least we have his words. One of the many voices from Dar al-Medina which still speak to us across 3 0 years of history, telling us of the highs and lows of lives, familiar to us even today. For most people, the New Kingdom had been an age of plenty, but it wasn't to last. The golden era of wealthy pharaohs was becoming ever more superficial. His son, Ramses II, was Egypt's most prolific builder, overspending on ever more ostentatious monuments, the best known of which was his temple at Abu Simbel. But such over-the-top building projects emptied the royal coffers, as did a series of costly foreign wars. So, by the time of Ramses III, the cracks had certainly begun to appear as inflation increased, supplies in the state granaries ran low, so the grain which formed the monthly wage, rations of state employees like tomb builders and artisans, was no longer paid when due, and it sparked the first recorded labor strike in history. It happened in 1155 BC, when the tomb builders began to complain that their food supplies hadn't been delivered. And when it happened again the following month, they simply down tools marched to the nearest temple and shouted, "We are hungry," to make sure their grievances were heard. They staged a sit-in at the temple, but the state's response only added insult to injury. Local officials could only hand round a delivery of pastries, not much use to anyone. The indifference of the authorities provoked many more weeks of protests. Their grievances only increased, and soon the striking workers had taken to shouting out at passing authority figures, including the mayor. The workers were finally fobbed off with enough supplies to shut them up in time for the pharaoh's jubilee celebration to pass by, unhindered by trouble. But the striking workers had highlighted the waning power of the monarchy, with the pharaoh now served by an increasingly inefficient and corrupt bureaucracy. The glorious bubble of royal extravagance finally burst, and the pharaoh's rivals were waiting in the wings. The priests of Karnak, having grown powerful through the revenues given to the gods they served, the writing for the royals was quite literally on the wall, and you can see what I mean in this little-known part of Karak Temple, where the high priest is making a very bold statement, but only if you know how to read the footnotes. Now this is a fascinating scene. We have the pharaoh, Ramses IX, and he's facing his high priest shown here, but there's something extraordinary about this scene, because for the first time, the pharaoh and the priest are shown On exactly the same scale, they are the same height. That's why the priest is looking so pleased. He has his arms raised as if in triumph. Because these guys are so clever, they've actually got the pharaoh standing on a box, so he's a fraction higher. And yet, in reality, they're the same height. This really shows that the priests are in power. They're basically saying to the king, we are the same size as you, therefore we are as important as you are. Priests have become full-time politicians, vying with the throne for power. They destabilized the balance between church and state, the relationship on which Egypt's entire culture depended. So great were their ambitions that, by the end of the New Kingdom, the priests took control of the entire south, and with the pharaoh ruling only the north, the country was split into its two ancient halves. But even worse was to come. It's at Medinet Habu Ramses' Isari temple that we can find out just how little interest these politician priests now had in the royal afterlife. They were only concerned with their own status and their own wealth. Now this next disturbing part of Egypt's story not only spelled disaster for its core belief in the royal afterlife, it left a torturous puzzle for Egyptologists, which we are still trying to piece together. It's an extraordinary story that begins not in the temple, but in a small house built later within the grounds, because the priest's corrupt ambitions will be put into practice by the man who lived here. His name was Buddha Arman, and as an Acropolis scribe, he worked in the nearby Valley of the Kings. This is the man himself, Buddha Arman, with his shaven head, his starched kilt, his arms raised in prayer. He's praying to the great god of thieves, Amon himself, although Buddha Arman's story doesn't quite live up to this image of piety, because it was here that he received a letter of instruction from his boss, the high priest of Karnak. This is a copy of that letter, and its contents are mind-blowing, because the high priest is telling Buddha Arman, go and perform for me a task on which you've never before embarked. Uncover a tomb among the ancient tombs, and preserve its sealed door until I return. And although this language is quite euphemistic and cryptic, both the sender and recipient knew exactly what it meant, and it would have a profound impact on Egypt. Buddha Arman had been promoted. His new title was Opener of the Gates of the Necropolis, so he and his men set out for the Valley of the Kings, taking with them tools and bundles of linen, their mission nothing less than the systematic dismantling of the royal cemetery in search of gold. It was in order to accumulate wealth. Tomb robbing itself was nothing new in ancient Egypt, but what's different about this looting is that it's an order from the ruler of Upper Egypt, the high priest himself. This is looting sanctioned by the state. Knowing the secret location of the royal tombs, Buddha Arman began what was euphemistically referred to as restoration work. The final taboo was about to be broken, so Uton and his men set to work. They break open the seal of every royal tomb, they move the lid of the sarcophagus, take out the royal mummy in its nest of gold coffins, and proceed to unwrap each one. Next, they strip them of anything of value. Gold masks, jewelry, and amulets, all taken for the temple treasury. As for the mummies, they're rewrapped in fresh linen, and all buried together for the cached priests. These royal tombs were no longer inviolable, but little more than a series of dead bodies, resting amidst the gold they needed to achieve their political aims. So for 20 years, this very tomb became one of Buddha Arman's rewrapping workshops, where archaeologists found fragments of the gold, prized from royal coffins, traces of the lost treasures of numerous pharaohs, and Buddha Arman's handwriting was discovered on the rewrapped mummy of Ramses III, with no regard for the sacred even. The great pharaoh Amenhotep III ended up repackaged in the coffin of Ramses III, covered with the ill-fitting lid of Seti II. Only one tomb hidden by rubble escaped a wholesale plunder, yet the ultimate violation of ancient Egypt's soul was now complete. Clearly the priest-kings of Karnak had got what they'd always wanted: absolute power, no longer interested in the royal ancestors who were simply a source of revenue to be robbed and discarded. The devout had become cynical, and the royal afterlife nothing more than an illusion. This is about as far north in Egypt as it's possible to get, because out there is the Mediterranean, to my west is Libya, to my east Palestine and Arabia, while Egypt itself lies down there to the south, 1,000 kilometers of desert cut right through the center by the mighty river Nile, and at its top lies the great port city of Alexandria. It was ancient Egypt's last and most influential capital. It was a city of great power, wealth, and luxury. The greatest in the world, Alexandria was also home of one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, Cleopatra, the final ruler of a Greek dynasty, and the last in a long line of foreign invaders who'd each claimed Egypt for themselves, seduced by its legendary splendors. By now, the pyramids were already thousands of years old. They were the beginning of a seemingly indestructible core belief that had survived chaos, famine, and war. It's as if they've been picked clean, a belief that would shine even more brightly in its fabled golden age, whose temples, tombs, and glittering treasures had made Egypt an irresistible temptation as jealous foreign rulers eyed a weakened Egypt. How could it survive successive waves of foreign attack? But Egypt had a secret weapon, a culture so strong and deep-rooted that it seduced and then absorbed all who would claim it as their own. Welcome to my story of ancient Egypt. Throughout the first millennium BC, Egypt faced wave after wave of foreign invaders, but, in the face of such a strong and long-lived culture, all who would try to take over Egypt would themselves be taken over almost 1,000 years before. Cleopatra Egypt had entered its third intermediate period, a time of political decline and vulnerability. Applause for it's the beginning of the 22nd dynasty around 945 BC. The priests are in charge of the south, but in the north, the vultures have started to circle, waiting for their chance to swoop as a group of Libyan generals seize power to rule as pharaohs of a divided land. In many ways, Egypt's waning power had been triggered by a loss of faith when the authority of the new kingdom pharaohs had begun to crumble. Egypt's once pious priests had helped loot the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, systematically dismantling Egypt's previously unshakable belief in the afterlife. With the decline in power of the new kingdom pharaohs, the Libyans who fought for the Egyptians as mercenary generals gradually infiltrated Egypt's power structure and eventually took power as the 22nd dynasty. The first king of the 22nd in Shishon had a number of sons who helped him keep control of Egypt, one of whom was called Nimlet, and these are the bracelets of Prince Nimlet. Egypt's Libyan rulers understood that looking and acting Egyptian would help to keep the country under their control. These beautiful bracelets are just a tiny fraction of the golden treasures created for Egypt's Libyan royals who, on the surface at least, upheld many of Egypt's most sacred traditions. They are portraying the very small figure of the god Horus, who symbolized Egyptian kingship, shown as a young child emerging from a lotus blossom, and on either side is protected by the rearing cobras, the royal urea symbol. Yet in some ways, these images are simply window dressing, lip service to ancient Egyptian traditions. In order to claim a greater prize for the Libyans, had organized nothing less than the state-sponsored plundering of Egypt's royal tombs that were so transfixed by the wealth, by the gold, by the bling of ancient Egypt. They wanted it for themselves, and over their several centuries rule, while they appear to look like pharaohs, and to rule as pharaohs. Egypt never feels to have been a cohesive, united kingdom. They weren't Egyptians at heart, and that's really what mattered in many ways. Libyan rule was destined to fail, because even if they were militarily superior, their adoption of Egyptian culture was at best superficial, was insufficient to unite the country. In the north, a squabbling Libyan elite fought amongst themselves, while in the south, the Egyptian priesthood, including yet more Libyan princes, still clung to power. The fragmented Egypt was easy pickings for any would-be invader. Egypt needed a regime that could reconnect with its most powerful asset, its history, and by 747 BC, that's what happened when the Kushite rulers of Nubia made a direct spiritual connection with Egypt's glorious past. Now the Kushites were Egypt's southern neighbors in Nubia, and from time immemorial they and the Egyptians had kind of battled around the sort of southern border of Egypt. By the 8th century BC, however, the Kushites had the upper hand. They were fervent believers in Egypt's traditional gods, in some ways making them more Egyptian than the Egyptians. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia was at the very edge of the Egyptian world. Having been repeatedly conquered by Egypt, the Kushites had been hugely influenced by Egyptian beliefs that centered on this great sandstone mountain Jebel Barkal. For centuries, it had been regarded as the mythical mound of creation, the mound from which Egypt's great creator god, Amun, was born. Here is the holy mountain. This is where the god lived in his primeval form. Dr. Tim Kendall has spent almost 30 years working at the site, being at the southern limit of the empire. It was where the Nile began, where fertility began, and so it had to be the place where creation began. So this was they imagined, this is the birthplace of the god Amun, and so this was the primeval car. When the new kingdom pharaohs had arrived here in 1500 BC, they built this temple and dedicated it to Amun and his wife, the goddess Mut. And when the Egyptians withdrew from Nubia some 400 years later, the native Kushites continued to honor the sacred mountain and Egypt's spiritual traditions. As the Kushite kings gained increasing military power, they also claimed Egypt for themselves. So when King Pi led a Kushite invasion of Egypt in 747 BC, he didn't plunder or destroy, but restored and rebuilt and founded Egypt's 25th dynasty. The irony is that he's conquering Egypt to put everything right, I suppose. So it's all such a cycle of rebirth, regrowth, redevelopment, and the Kushite kings are really kind of tapping into that ancient power source and just sort of giving it back to the Egyptian starting time all over again and doing it right. So they had that same sense of history and continuity as the Egyptians. They are the natural successors of the 18th dynasty kings, fueled by a genuine desire to make their own mark in Egypt's long story. The Kushites began to rebuild Egypt. Here and there, Nubian heartland, King Pi expanded the existing temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal to balance the original great temple of Karnak and Egyptian Thebes. But while the Kushites had absorbed the culture of Egypt, they still had their roots. Here in Africa, this cultural fusion is quite clearly expressed in this extraordinary representation of the Egyptian goddess, Mut. The face of the goddess Mut has tribal scars, and look, we'll see if it shows with this light. You see the 3 lines of her face. So this is an Egyptian goddess with a Nubia makeover, yeah? She was a goddess of Nubia, and it was appropriate for Nubians to have tribal scars. So this is a very, very graphic version of the way in which local Nubians were making the traditional deities of Egypt their own, physically marking them. It's as if she's being stamped as a Nubian. Yep, how incredible this is. Such a land of surprises that is beautiful, yet this land of surprises has something else in store. To gale forts. Winds whip up the worst sandstorm in years. It's a powerful reminder that the ancients would also have had to deal with such dramatic natural phenomena. You certainly taste the grapes in your tea. The ancients would have tackled this using spells, rituals. They would also have made extra offerings to specific deities, most notably Osiris's brother god, Seth, the god of turbulence, the god of storms, the god of red-headed individuals, who is seen as somewhat turbulent too. Can't imagine why I'm seeking shelter in this shrine cut into the mountain by Pi's son Taharka, which is currently undergoing major restoration by an Italian mission. It apparently reveals graphic evidence of Egypt's continuing powerful influence, never been here before. I have no idea what's going on in here, so this will be as new to me as it is to you. Oh, flipping heck, it's a real privilege to see the time-blackened walls finally giving up their secrets. Wow, look at that, look at that. Oh, that is so beautiful. They're bringing out not just the golds but the blues. These two colors, the bright blue of the sky and the Nile and the gold, this sort of really powerful color of the sun god. This is Taharka, the Kushites' most powerful and important pharaoh. In classic Egyptian style, he's shown offering to the god Amun and his wife, the goddess Mut. It's raised relief. This is old school. This is old school technique. This is skill, and they're all overlaid in this yellow gold, and you can even see the little scales on this corselet that Amun's wearing. Every detail's here. It's fabulous. It's like Christmas morning. This is just extraordinary. Just look for yourselves. Just look. Look at their faces. Look at their eyes. This wall truly exemplifies Egypt's ancient magic, as those who try to conquer it end up being seduced by it and then become a part of it. It's a sincere attempt by Taharka to connect his kingship to the achievements of the pharaohs of Egypt's past, in particular to the rulers of the new kingdom. So, although history records that Taharka conquered Egypt, this scene reveals it's actually Egypt that conquered Taharka. It's as if the Egyptian identity will always win out, no matter what, so much so that Taharka is even shown with the ram's horns of Amun, identifying him as the son of Egypt's god of gods. These were worn by Amata III in Luxor Temple in the 18th dynasty. They were later worn by the great Alexander to show he too was the son of Amun, and here we have Taharka in all his finery, in all his splendor. Applause. Who knew that they were here hidden away in this special rock? We've come to the heart of Jebel Barkal. Now we've come to the heart of Egyptian religion, because this is the very birthplace of Amun himself, and here it is just for us right now, emerging from the walls. Very few people have ever seen this. Here inside the temple, where only the most pious were allowed to hearken, is shown in deference to Egypt's most powerful god, and outside on the mountain he exhibits his devotion on a truly monumental scale by embellishing the very top of its pinnacle, 180 meters tall and 11 meters from the cliff face. It seems completely inaccessible, but Taharka pulled off an incredible technical achievement. He built a crane arm and elaborate scaffolding in order to make his own permanent mark on the mountain. What he did was he made an inscription for himself, commemorating his victories east and west, and then underneath, his men set a small statue of the king, and they covered the inscription with gold. Today, you can hardly see it, but in those days it would have been the most conspicuous feature of the mountain. I mean, that's meant to be seen by the gods, of course. No mortal eye could read this from the ground, but that wasn't the point. This was a message to the gods carved on a monument built to impress, completely covered in gold. It reflected the sun's rays, and it acted like a giant billboard, as it telegraphed Taharka's message for miles around. And this again hecked back to Egypt's past, when previous pharaohs had placed gilded capstones on their pyramids and obelisks to harness the potent powers of the sun. Just to the east of Jebel Barkal lies the necropolis of Nuri, where the Kushite king's transformation into Egyptian pharaohs was finally completed. For the dynasty who invaded Egypt were now copying Egypt's ultimate symbol, and for the first time in over 1,000 years, the kings who ruled Egypt were buried in pyramids. When the kings made their capital at Memphis, they were living right across the river from the Great Pyramids. Pharaoh spent most of his life there and was familiar with the Great Pyramids, and so when he died he needed a pyramid of commensurate scale, and in this he sort of established this new type, and it was followed by all of his successors. The Kushites eventually built more pyramids here in their Nubian homeland than the Egyptians had built in Egypt, and just as at Giza, the Harkis pyramid is precisely aligned to its environment, for on the exact day when the Nile flood begins to recede, the sun sets just like this directly behind the Jebel Barkal pinnacle, yet only on this specific day, and only when viewed from the top of Taharka's pyramid. That is totally impressive. Not just a skill, a feat of engineering, but such devotion to the gods. The gods observing nature. I mean, it would take huge amount of observation to get the position just right, to get the date just right, surrounded by these pyramids. The images of Amun and Mut and their monumental temples. It's easy to forget that the Kushites were actually a foreign power who'd taken Egypt by force, yet it's almost as if Egypt was taunting its invaders. While you may try and dominate our land, our culture will ultimately dominate you. And as such, the Kushites left a legacy of renewal and resurrection. But like all Egypt's conquerors, the Kushites' moment in the sun was fleeting, for their 25th dynasty lasted but a century, as a far more ruthless and ambitious power now invaded in 674 BC. The fearsome Assyrian army marched into Egypt as ruthless expansionists. They had little interest in Egyptian culture. They graphically demonstrated their contempt by sacking the sacred city of Thebes. The Assyrians, unlike the Egyptians, they're interested in expanding their empire and really taking over other parts of the world. And they do that by violence. This very un-Egyptian bronze helmet was discovered in Thebes. It is one of the very few objects that reveal the Assyrian takeover of Egypt. Despite possessing equally powerful iconography of their own, the Assyrians had little time to leave their mark. They simply stamped their authority upon Egypt by trying to rip out its religious heart. This holy complex, this really huge sacred space, had never been attacked in Egyptian history, and so for a mob to damage the temple, to damage statues perhaps, to damage precious things, would really have been absolute anathema to the Egyptians. What's really striking is, it's obviously not an Egyptian item, but the Egyptians didn't even wear helmets, did they? They relied on their thick hair, didn't they? So for me, it really evokes a completely alien image. I mean, the Assyrians. War was their business, wasn't it? With their sophisticated weapons and armor, the Assyrians were a war machine whose unstoppable progress seemed to spell disaster for Egypt. Yet after little more than 20 years, the Assyrians returned east to tackle problems at home, leaving vassals in charge of Egypt based at the delta city of Sis. These were the Sikh kings, shrewd Egyptian politicians, who first appeared to serve their Assyrian masters but soon became strong enough to declare their independence. Egypt was now back in Egyptian hands. The Sikhs instigated a spectacular renaissance in native culture, at the heart of which lay Egypt's most powerful symbol of national identity, mummification, but no longer limited to humans. There was an explosion of animal mummification, everything from dogs, cats, crocodiles, ibis, and even tiny shrews. The ancient Egyptians had always mummified their dead, both human and animal, and with the Sikhs we can almost see it as a way of the Sikh kings trying to declare, we are Egypt, we are important. This is what makes us special. No one else in the ancient world could mummify like the Egyptians, and so they rolled it out a millionfold with animals specifically bred for mummification and then sold as offerings at temples the Sikhs had reinvigorated. Egypt's oldest industry, death, was once again big business. Now this might look pretty silly, but around 2,000 years ago here at Saqqara, this would have been a very common sight. This place would have been packed with pilgrims, with priests, making animal mummies, and they'd be trundling the mummies across the landscape in carts like this one. So we must get out of our minds this idea of Egyptian priests as these pious, quiet figures wafting through the landscape, when by this time it was all carried out in great numbers, and it was Egypt's endless ability to reinterpret its core beliefs that was the key to its longevity for millennia. The Egyptians had believed that the pharaoh was a living god who embodied the soul of Egypt. When the king died, their soul lived on in their mummified body, which must be kept safe to guarantee the continuity of Egypt, so they'd always buried the rulers in the safety of pyramids or elaborate rock-cut tombs. But in times of increasing unrest and foreign rule, the Egyptians could no longer rely on even having a pharaoh to bury, and so they turned to another centuries-old practice. The Surup at Saqqara is a huge subterranean tomb complex in which the concepts of kingship and animal mummification were fused together. For each of these giant granite sarcophagi once contained an animal believed to embody all the qualities of kingship. This is the burial site of the sacred Apis bull. These were the bodies of mummified bulls of such importance to the Egyptian mindset. They extended all this effort and cost to create a suitably impressive burial site, and they've done this in spades. As one bull dies and is mummified and buried, the other one is then wear-upped in life and at death, mummified and buried again. And so there's a real progression. The cult of the Apis bull dates right back to the beginning of Egyptian history, and it's closely linked to the pharaoh. It was believed that when the sacred bull died, it became one with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and so became an Osiris Apis, or Capis for short. And these sacred bulls became hugely important under the Sikhs during times of foreign occupation, when Egypt was increasingly being ruled by pharaohs in absentia, be it in Persia or wherever else. For the Egyptians, they needed a physical presence, and the Apis provided this presence because they could see it with their own eyes. They could celebrate rituals in its company, and at death it would be mummified and then buried in the manner of pharaohs, going back for millennia. So it was crucial to have this creature here, each one successively buried in a sarcophagus. Just like this one, we're looking at some serious devotion to this sacred creature and everything it represented for Egypt in many ways, the Serapeum is Egypt writ large, in which its core beliefs are taken to extremes. Being down here really makes you feel minuscule. You realize you're now walking amongst the gods' words. Fail me frankly because of the enormity of it all. But that was the thing. That was the skill of the Egyptians. They batter you over the head with this idea of the colossal, the monumental, the spectacular, yet the Egyptians' devotion to the epist bull had left them vulnerable by embodying the power of Egypt within a single living animal. They had created an easy target. Given the API's bull's divine status, harming it would have been completely unthinkable, but when the Persian kings invaded Egypt, he had other plans. The Persian Empire swept west, taking all before it, and then into Egypt itself. The Persian king, Cambyses, entered Egypt in 525 BC and destroyed the Sete dynasty. Much like the Assyrians, the Persians were ruthless expansionists, chiefly interested in enlarging their empire, and Cambyses seemed to have trampled all over Egypt's ancient traditions. Having taken Egypt by force, Cambyses burnt the mummy of the previous Sete pharaoh before stabbing the API's bull, which slowly bled to death, and by doing this, Cambyses was sending a very clear message to the Egyptians. I am now in charge. For the next 200 years, the Egyptians were little more than the heavily taxed servants of the Persian Empire, and with all attempts at rebellion met with extreme retaliation. Egypt needed a savior, an outsider who could be transformed by Egypt's powerful ideology, and in return could transform Egypt into the Macedonian Superman. Enter Alexander. The great Alexander was one of the world's greatest military leaders, and during his short life, amassed an empire that stretched across 3 continents, founding over 70 cities that bore his name after his initial defeat of the Persian king. Alexander marched unopposed into Egypt in 332 BC. The world's most successful empire builder had arrived, not only transforming Egypt's future, but preserving its ancient past. It really is no exaggeration to say that Alexander the Great is one of the most remarkable people who ever lived. He really was the superhero of the ancient world, so you'd think that Egypt would be filled with his images. After all, he had saved them from the hated Persians, and yet other than the great city of Alexandria that bears his name, he is remarkably hard to find within Egypt's traditional temples, except here in this modest little shrine at the heart of Luxor Temple. Alexander was not only a brilliant soldier, but a master politician marching into Egypt's ancient capital, Memphis. Amid rumors, he was the son of Egypt's last native pharaoh. This instantly plugged him into Egypt's long native history, and he was crowned as a traditional pharaoh. Here he is, the great man, repeatedly across the walls of this limestone shrine, and yet you'd never know it was Alexander simply by looking, because he looks like every other Egyptian pharaoh. But you knew their secret, that to rule Egypt you had to appear to be an Egyptian, and he did this brilliantly to the extent that he had his name, his Greek name, Alexandros, written in the Egyptian tradition, even in a royal cartoon, and it's the only giveaway that this is Alexander the Great, because there is his name, Alexandros, written in typical Egyptian style, and there he's even wearing the red, the white jewel crown of a united land, and so he's encapsulating everything that it was to be an Egyptian pharaoh. Just like the Kushite king Taharqa at Jebel Barkal, Alexander is shown offering incense to the king of the gods, Amun, but simply connecting with the gods wasn't enough. Alexander understood that real power came from becoming a god, and so he undertook a perilous journey across the Libyan desert to the remote oasis shrine of Siwa, where he could commune with the oracle of Amun himself. And it's said in this legendary story that the god actually said to him, "You are my son," and from then on something clicked in Alexander's mind, and he went off to conquer the rest of the ancient world, truly believing he was divine, and he had the full blessing and support of Ammon himself, the king of the gods of Egypt. Alexander would only stay in Egypt for 6 short months, but during his time here he founded a city that would be his lasting legacy, the great city of Alexandria, built on the Mediterranean coast to create trading links with the rest of the ancient world. The later historian Arrian recorded that Alexander had laid out the city's general plan himself, but lacking chalk or other means, he resorted to marking it out with grain. When a flock of birds began eating the grain, Alexander regarded this as a bad omen. Yet his religious advisor quickly spun bad news into good and interpreted this as a sign that the new city would soon prosper and would one day feed the whole world, a remarkably accurate prophecy, for within a very few years Alexandria would not only be Egypt's new capital but the greatest city on earth, although Alexander himself would never see it. Yet, despite his pious nature, Alexander was essentially a soldier in his quest to conquer the Persian Empire. He left Egypt in 331 BC, never to return alive. Moving as far east as India, he conquered an empire of 2 million square miles before dying in Babylon, aged only 32, but still undefeated and still the pharaoh of Egypt at death. Alexander was mummified, and his body became the focus of a power struggle. Some of his officers wanted him buried in his Greek homeland, but for others he had to return to Egypt and be buried as a pharaoh. thereby preserving Egypt's long traditions, but it obviously meant that anyone who possessed his mummified body could also claim the throne of Egypt, and clues to this drama can be found here in the windswept desert of Saqqara, 10 years after he'd left Egypt alive. Alexander returned here, for his body had been mummified Egyptian style, and it became a hugely powerful talisman for whoever held the body of Alexander the Great. Held Egypt while en route to Greece, his cortege was diverted and his mummified body brought here too. Egypt's ancient necropolis of Saqqara, exactly where his tomb itself was, remains a mystery, although situated just meters from the Serapeum is this collection of very un-Egyptian-looking statues, and it's these somewhat sandblasted statues that give us a real clue that Alexander may initially have been buried somewhere close by, because these are the sculpted images of some of the greatest scholars and artists of ancient Greece, although exactly who has kept academics scratching their heads for years. The likely identities reveal a direct link to the world in which Alexander grew up and was educated. Laughter. Take Homer, for example. His great warrior hero, Achilles, was Alexander's lifelong role model, Plato, who had tutored Aristotle, who in turn had tutored Alexander, and Pindar, whose poetry had praised Alexander's Macedonian ancestors. As for who placed these statues here, the most likely candidate is Alexander's general and probable half-brother Ptolemy, for by burying Alexander here close to Egypt's ancient capital, Memphis, Ptolemy could legitimize his own takeover of Egypt, and by laying claim to Alexander's body and to Egypt, he founded the dynasty named after himself, the fabulous and outrageous Ptolemies, ruling Egypt for the last 3 centuries BC. The Ptolemaic dynasty would be Egypt's final flowering 15 male kings, all named Ptolemy, with their female co-rulers, half of whom were called Cleopatra, Macedonian Greek. By descent, their dynasty would bring Greek-style culture, knowledge, and fabulous wealth into Egypt, while at the same time immersing themselves in Egypt's irresistible religion and customs. They were very, very sensitive to the cultural practices and the religious sensibilities of the Egyptians. They knew that to control this ancient land of Egypt, they had to tap into what made Egypt powerful, what made Egypt special. They wore the right clothes, the right crowns, they built the right temples, they worshipped the right gods, and the Ptolemies relocated Egypt's capital from Memphis to their new supercity, Alexandria. Built to Alexander's original plan, it was one of the most lavish construction projects on earth. The historian Strabo would later comment that the city had magnificent public precincts and royal palaces that covered a fourth or even a third of the entire area. The colonnaded marble streets were over 10 meters wide. There were public baths, a huge gymnasium, and one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world, the 135 meters tall lighthouse that guided ships safely into port. And at the center of the city, Alexander himself, whose mummified body had been exhumed from Saqqara and brought here at the Ptolemies, had built a capital unlike anything Egypt had ever seen before. For in Alexandria, a new Egypt was being born. The creation of Alexandria and the great influx of immigrants gave it a freshness, of vivacity, and really kind of transformed the ancient culture, whereas previously, the Egyptian civilization had developed along the Nile and in many ways was quite inward-looking, quite insular. I think the fact that Alexandria was open to so many diverse influences religiously, culturally, and this gave it a real air of tolerance. I think I'd have felt very at home here. There's a real sense of culture and learning and appreciation of life. Today, Alexandria is the largest city on the Mediterranean, stretching for over 20 miles. Along the coast, as Egypt's largest seaport, it caters for over 80% of the country's imports and exports, a legacy that reaches directly back to the Ptolemies. Having improved Egyptian agriculture by reclaiming new farmland through increased irrigation, they supplemented the Egyptian staples with new crops, such as cotton and better grapes, for wine production, and today, the markets of Alexandria still buzz with some of the early city's lively cosmopolitan-style welcome. I'm going to try and find the nearest equivalent to ancient Egyptian delicacies, and these are dates, and the ancient Egyptians used to make pastries and bread from them, because they are very sweet too. I think I might have to taste one just for quality control. You understand? See how authentic they are? They are very nice. This is incense in its raw state, and of course, this was burnt in temples and in Nerari, writes the port. City of Alexandria became a huge hub of international trade, establishing roots with Greece, the Middle East, India, and even Britain, and as native Egyptian goods like papyrus and perfume flowed out of the country. New exotic luxuries like spices, silks, and wines poured in. The Greeks loved olives, and so these were imported, and the Egyptians started to grow them. I'll definitely have some of these delicious black pepper. We've got to get some black pepper. This is one of the really popular things, certainly in Ptolemaic times, because markets had opened up certainly as far east as India, and the Greeks went crazy for this stuff. It's certainly lively shopping in Egypt. Never a dull moment with Alexandria. Now at the heart of the ancient world, the rest of Egypt benefited too. For determined to honor their adopted country's long history, the Ptolemies undertook a massive temple rebuilding and restoration. Program ended, modern visitors can often fail to realize that many of the places they visit were either built or restored by the Ptolemies, Esner Edifudender. Combo, all of these atomic buildings that tourists and scholars admire so much, and yet they really don't give sufficient credit to the people whose vision created them. The most impressive of all such temples lies the farthest from Alexandria, deep into Upper Egypt, close to Asan, is the stunning temple of Feli, which, in Egyptian, meant the end, since it was located at the very southern edge of Egypt. Much of the temple was built by Ptolemy II and his co-ruler and sister Arino. There was a law passed by her husband Ptolemy to say a statue of Arino had to be erected in every single temple in Egypt. She had to become its resident goddess. Arino was a powerful female pharaoh associated with the goddess Isis, a role the famous Cleopatra would adopt 2 centuries later, and under the Ptolemies Feli became a major center of the Isis cult. And here in the heart of Feli, Temple Hour, Senoi's golden statue would have stood side by side with that of Isis, so the walls are full of images of Isis and her fellow gods. According to myth, Isis was responsible for the vital Nile flood swelling the river as she wept tears of sorrow for her murdered husband Osiris, who she then resurrected, and with its spectacular location, Feli still retains its hugely spiritual atmosphere. I think it's that sense of continuity you really feel when you're up here. You feel like you're at the center of the world. Suppose for the ancient Egyptians, you were the center of the religious world, and at this point, which was the heart of ancient Egyptian religion, way into the Christian era, way into the 6th century AD, kind of messes with your head. It's a very, very holy place, this. But while Feli was becoming an increasingly important center of Egyptian religion, its new capital, Alexandria, had become the leading center of knowledge for the Ptolemies, created some of the first scholarships, attracting academics from across the world to study a wide range of subjects: biology, theology, astronomy, geometry, anatomy, philosophy, and of course, my own personal favorite, history. And at the center of this intellectual hothouse was the famous royal library. Up to 500,000 works were once housed within to compete with the famous schools of Plato and Aristotle in Athens, and today, that legacy lives on with Alexandria's striking new library. Ptolemies really did appreciate that knowledge was power, and they wanted that power, so they brought together in this one single place some of the greatest works in human history: the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the works of Aristotle the philosopher, the Old Testament scriptures, and all the accumulated knowledge from the temples of ancient Egypt, all brought into this one single building. The great library also contained the works of Herodotus, a Greek historian who traveled the length of Egypt over a century before the Ptolemies had come to power. His accounts sum up the Greek fascination with Egyptian society. Not only is the climate different from that of the rest of the world, and the river unlike any other river, but the people also, in most of their manners and customs, exactly reverse the common practice of mankind. For the women attend the markets and trade, while the men sit at home and do the weaving. Indeed, the level of equality of Egypt's women shocked Herodotus, something he vividly records when he witnessed a group of men and women traveling together by boat to the delta city of Bubastis. Some of the women make a noise with clappers, others play the oboe, while the rest of the women and men sing and clap their hands. Some of the women shout mockery to the women of that town they are passing, whilst others dance and others stand up and expose their private parts in temples. The length of Egypt, the Ptolemies ensured they were portrayed as Egyptian pharaohs, making them almost indistinguishable from their native Egyptian predecessors. Yet, in Alexandria, the blend of Greek and Egyptian could sometimes create a hybrid of rather strange results. Hi, Namin. Hi, how are you, Namin? Sammy is a local historian who spent years studying this remarkable tomb complex built just after the TMIC period, and here we come to the unique period chamber that's mad, that is fabulous, guarded by Greek Doric columns. The entrance is covered in images of Egyptian gods who would ensure safe passage into the afterlife. It's like a tomb, but it's also like a temple. A facade of a temple, but a typical Egyptian style. Yeah, it's really protecting the entrance. Yeah, you know why Cobra is choosing to be presented in the tombs? Because the Cobra has no eyelashes. It keeps her eyes open 24 hours, which means it's awake to protect the tomb for 24 hours a day and night. I love these snakes. That's a very Greek-looking snake, but it's wearing a very little ancient Egyptian crown. That's crazy. Exactly. They literally are throwing everything they've got at this tomb. I mean, Medusa, Horus Sundisk, to guarantee safety, this is the best garden doorway I've seen in Egypt. It's got everything here, and the statues, they represent the inhabitants of the tomb, a single wealthy family. These two exhibit an odd mix of the Greek and Egyptian. I think the bodies are ancient Egyptian, the stance is ancient Egyptian, the man's kilt is Egyptian. From the neck down, they're Egyptian, but from the neck up there, European. It's clear the tomb owners had done everything they could to ensure safe passage into the Egyptian afterlife. Oh look, it's the episcopal. Even if they didn't quite understand how it all worked. All the features are there. You've got Thoth with you know presenting the oils, and Anu doing the same, mummifying the dead. You've even got big jars underneath. Kind of big jaws and feather of might, the goddess of justice. Without her approval, you will never cross the other side. He didn't forget to add a Greek touch in a lower part to depictions of Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine and fertility. Clearly, these tomb occupants intended to continue the lives they lived in Alexandria into the beyond. I want all. What I enjoy in life to be with thee, of course, in other sites, especially the wine. What a great place to spend eternity. Despite its rather cartoon-like quality, the apparent opulence of this tomb demonstrates the desire of the Alexandrian elite to integrate into Egyptian culture, yet in many ways it was little more than a veneer hiding the real force that would ultimately destroy Egypt. For where the external invaders had largely tried and failed, Egypt's real nemesis would be the Tummies. Famous love of luxury and excess. Much of this luxury was just a facade for the royals of Alexandria, notorious for their love of display, were like actors on a stage. As one ancient commentator observed, everything in Egypt is simply play acting and painted scenery, a comment which cuts to the heart of this melodramatic monarchy for whom image was everything, because while the ruling elite were living it up in Alexandria, other parts of Egypt were far from content. By the end of the 3rd century BC, Egypt was once more riven with civil war. Upper Egypt began to rebel, and it fell to Ptolemy V to try and fight the fires of anarchy. So not only did he portray himself as an Egyptian, he went even further in his support for Egypt's ancient beliefs. In doing so, he left the world one of its most famous ancient artifacts, the Rosetta Stone. It's best known as the means by which the French scholar Champollion was first able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822, and we can tell that the inscription on the stone was of huge importance because it was written out in 3 types of script: Greek, Deotic, and hieroglyphic. In a way, you could almost describe it as a kind of news bulletin. It's the priests of Memphis issuing this decree to let as many people know exactly what the religious and the political policy was of crown and clergy, and it particularly focuses on Ptolemy V's generous patronage. The priests are praising him because he's the one that gives wealth to the temple and gives due honor and respect to the sacred animals, which were such an integral part of Egyptian religion. The priests really are grateful to their atomic pharaoh, who they see as wanting to sort of tap into the ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Egyptian religion, much like Alexander had, much like the Scythes had, and the Cushites had. They knew that to attain true power, true control in Egypt, you had to do things the Egyptian way. Yet Ptolemy V's philanthropy came at a price. Keeping the peace in Egypt proved cripplingly expensive, so the second half of the Ptolemaic dynasty was ridden by debt, corruption, and vicious civil war. Soon, the expanding Roman Empire bore down on a divided Egypt. Only the famous Cleopatra stood in their way. In the mold of great-uncle Alexander, she believed herself divine and managed to hold the Romans at bay for over 20 years, but not even the great Cleopatra could prevent the inevitable. And so it was that in August 30th BC, Cleopatra's famous suicide brought an end to ancient Egypt as we know it. This epic culture, which had lasted for 30 years, came to an end in a matter of days, when on the 31st of August, Egypt was formally annexed by Rome. This was Egypt's point of no return, a slow, painful decline of Egyptian beliefs and culture until the arrival of Christianity, with its numerous temples abandoned, built over, or simply destroyed. Egypt's glories began to fade from memory, but Egypt's great story can now be traced back 20 years to the very origins of its magical culture, which had evolved from its unique environment, creating a series of sophisticated beliefs, able to unite a country to build great monuments. It had survived chaos and famine, only to rise again in a glorious zenith of rebirth and resurrection. Even waves of foreign invasions were ultimately assimilated by Egypt's powerful traditions, and despite being eventually absorbed into the Roman Empire, the ancient culture had continued until the arrival of Christianity. It, as the Egyptians had always believed, there would be a life after death. Cleopatra's Needle, on London's embankment, had lain forgotten in Egypt until the 19th century, but as pioneering Egyptologists began a 200-year process of rediscovery, ancient Egypt was reborn, and this time it went global. And what a privilege it is for us today to be able to see such wonderful things and capture just a glimpse of this fascinating ancient culture, the culture of a people at one with their environment and who captured through their timeless monuments their own unique view of the world. In fact, the story of Egypt is far from over, for its rediscovery means that it is only just beginning, and it's the things that made the Egyptians so very special have ensured that they're now known right across the world, and they've achieved their ultimate goal to live forever.